In the early 90s, Riverside's women became the target of a sadistic killer.
We have bodies all over the county. We were on this thing at 24/7.
His victims subjected to a twisted form of brutality.
He had taken the breast that he had cut off and tossed it maybe 30, 40 feet away.
As his confidence grew,
he wanted to be in power. He wanted to be in authority. He wanted to be in control.
The body count rose.
We had to catch him. He wasn't going to stop.
Once you get the taste of blood like that and you're a serial murderer, you're going to continue doing it.
But what was the root of his inner fury?
He would turn around and look at me and it's like, oh God, now I'm going to get it.
And was he born to kill? Riverside City in Southern California. A community originally built on the rich pickings of a booming citrus industry. By the 1990s, the farming fortunes had faded away, but a shift to light industry had revitalized the local economy, ensuring the sun-drenched community was still firmly on the map.
Riverside was very much considered a suburb of the Los Angeles area. We were about 50 miles east of Los Angeles and of Orange County, and it was a very quiet community. People loved it.
It was very social, very friendly. It reminded me a lot of southern communities.
Although crime figures were generally low, one area did not live up to the city's clean-cut reputation.
This was quite the boulevard in the day where everybody hung out.
Former detective Christine Kears recalls Riverside's notorious crime hotspot.
University Avenue was, I would say, a cluttered street, disheveled, drug dealers, gang members, prostitutes.
After dark, you didn't want to drive down there if you were a normal citizen.
From the freeway up, the girls would hang out and the Johns would pick them up.
They were drug users, they had families to support, so they would go out and work the streets, getting money, turning tricks, getting their heroin, and taking care of their families.
Although Detective Kears was used to the daily challenges thrown up by the streets, a call to a factory complex in December 1991 would reveal a crime of an altogether different nature.
The middle section of this trash bin holder was open. And the body was right here.
27-year-old local prostitute Susan Sternfield had been brutally strangled. But the killer's twisted actions had not ended there. He had elaborately positioned the victim's body after she had died.
She was what we call posed. She wasn't just laid out, she wasn't just dumped there. Her feet, her hands, her legs were positioned by the perpetrator.
The body was posed for us, legs open, basically saying, here's your trash, it's right here. Brings back those horrible memories.
But the bizarre nature of the crime had been witnessed before in Riverside.
There was a worker at another industrial complex who was cleaning, and he went to the dumpster and found a body lying inside.
As in the case of Susan Sternfield, prostitute Cheryl Coker had been brutally strangled. The killer had also spent time displaying the victim's body after her death.
She was basically laid there, her legs were spread apart.
Rarely does the killer position the body or take the clothes off the body. It was a very purposeful, specific killing.
When a killer poses victims, it's a kind of in-your-face statement to whoever finds them. So it adds one more layer to their feeling of power.
Detectives were also shocked to discover that the victim's body had been grotesquely mutilated.
On Cheryl, there was a severed breast.
We found it up the hill where he would have thrown it. It was probably at least around 50 to 70 feet from the body, so it was a purposeful heave.
That he obviously did not like prostitutes or did not like ladies of this nature because of the violence that had taken place with her.
As Detective Kears compared the cases of the two murdered women, she quickly began to fear the worst.
I went back and spoke with my superiors and told them that we've got a pattern going here. So where this is going to take us, we'll find out.
We were beginning to sense that we had a serial killer in our midst.
The Riverside community would remain unaware of the danger lurking amongst them. One such resident was easygoing local Bill Suff. "23 years previously, he had been fresh out of high school in nearby Lake Elsinore. As an awkward teenager, he had never managed to land a long-term girlfriend, but one local girl had caught his eye.
I was about 15, and it was at a football game in California. I saw him, and he seemed like a pretty nice guy. He was good looking, and he had a nice smile. He was kind of shy. I gave him my phone number. I said, give me a call. And I really did not expect to hear from him again.
Although Bill relocated to Texas for basic military training, he exchanged a number of letters with Terrell. However, some weeks later, a phone call from the new recruit would be met by some shocking news.
I did tell him that I wasn't going to be able to see him anymore because I had, been raped and I got pregnant. And he said, no, let's get married. I'll take care of your child. And so December 13th, 1969, we were married.
The newly wedded serviceman was away in Texas when Terrell's daughter was born.
He came back and told me that we couldn't take the baby back with us to Texas because he had told his superiors that the baby died. And that kind of threw me.
Bill would arrange for his mother and stepfather to adopt Terrell's newly born baby. Several years earlier, Suff's own childhood in a single-parent family had fallen somewhat short of the all-American dream.
Bill Suff grew up with a very dominant, cold, non-loving mother. He was always trying to acquire his mother's approval, and she denied it to him at every turn.
His father left when they were young, so conversations about the past, I think he was trying to avoid them.
As the eldest of 5 siblings, Suff would take on a leading role in the household.
Bill's place in the family was really the substitute patriarch. The other kids got into trouble ranging from killing animals to starting fires, and Bill was always the hero who got them out of trouble.
The fact that Suff had to take over a lot of responsibilities when his father left would have affected him in some ways, but I think because of this, he probably found a way of controlling others and controlling his environment.
But despite being a dominant force at home, Suff wouldn't stand out at school.
He was involved in the high school marching band. He didn't have any disciplinary issues or problems. His grades were pretty average, nothing unusual.
But the reserved teenager was evidently not happy with his lot.
He was trying to get attention from his different classmates. He was like a non-entity.
Most of his friends and acquaintances didn't think of him as certainly the big man on campus.
He was desperate for approval and recognition, and he wasn't receiving it from anybody. And it just infuriated him. It created this powerful rage in him to prove his worth, his value, and his power, basically.
As Suff continued his studies, no one could have ever imagined the extent to which he would go to make his mark. In December 1990, police suspected a link between the brutal murders of 2 riverside prostitutes. Both victims had been strangled and elaborately displayed in a ritualistic manner. As police searched for leads, they were desperate to catch the perpetrator, who was striking directly at the vulnerable women within the community.
The women that would work University Avenue were actually pretty well known. Many of them grew up in the Riverside area. That's where they went to school. Their families were there as well.
Having worked in the Vice Squad, Detective Kears knew the girls well and was determined to restore safety on the streets.
I think they felt like I understood, so they would share things with me.
I would make sure I would go out and meet the girls, and I would give them advice and tell them, be very careful. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm just letting you know that we have a crazy man out here that's killing prostitutes.
Many were left with little choice but to continue working the streets. 10 months earlier, one such woman in nearby Lake Elsinore had been 35-year-old Carol Lynn Miller.
My mom was this tiny little pretty thing, but she was like a force of nature. She was this sweet, loving mom, and she liked to write poems and draw and go to church. I have photographs that we would take during that time, and I can see it in my face. I can see it in my eyes and my smile, just how happy I was to be with my mother.
However, Carol Lynn's life was becoming increasingly troubled. Although he frequently visited her, Shannon would predominantly be brought up by his grandparents.
She also had this dark side that was kind of shrouded by drugs, so I got to see both sides of her. She was a prostitute, and I had to come to terms with that. But through all those times, she was always my mom, and as I got older, I started to understand more her struggles.
But in February 1990, tragedy struck.
My grandma threw her arms around me and said, I'm sorry. Your mom passed away.
Carol Lynn's body had been discovered in an isolated spot within a citrus grove. Her body had been displayed in a brazen manner after her death, caused by asphyxiation and multiple stab wounds.
She had a number of centered stab wounds to her chest. They weren't random, not slashing, just very deliberate.
I got hit with a sledgehammer. That's what it felt like to me. My body swelled with emotion. I felt like the world was collapsing in around me. And I went out to my little trailer that I lived in behind Grandma's, and I just laid on the bed, collapsing.
Although Carol Lynn's displayed body bore the marks of a brutal attack, an object discovered at the scene revealed a different side to her twisted killer.
And there was a partially eaten grapefruit by the body.
If he felt he could eat a grapefruit while standing there and looking at the body, looking at and admiring his work, and that would tell one that he is definitely not worried about the police catching him.
When an individual goes above and beyond what is necessary to kill the person, it tells you just how gratifying it is for him to expose himself to the risk of apprehension in order to carry out what he's doing.
The Sheriff's Department had also discovered 2 other victims, bizarrely displayed on open ground, their bodies subjected to mutilation and other grotesque forms of abuse.
One victim was found with a light bulb that had been inserted up her vaginal area. We had items stuffed down people's throats and mouths after they were dead.
When Detective Kears linked the method of murder with the cases in Riverside, there could be no doubt the sadistic crimes were the work of one man.
The cause of death in these cases were strangulation. The pressure was so much, it would break the bone here. So it was quite violent.
Strangulation for murder is very personal, puts the person very close to the victim and feeling the life force leaving. So that is often about domination and a feeling of power.
Despite a lack of witnesses, the brazen killer had left tire marks and carpet fibers at many of the murder scenes, giving investigators an insight into his movements.
And so they realized the perpetrator was going back and forth between the county sheriff's department area and the city in the same vehicles, and that they needed to combine resources to finding this person and stopping him.
As detectives created a joint task force, Riverside County Warehouse would be called upon to help with logistics. One of the regular stock clerks was local man 40-year-old Bill Suff.
He would provide us with all the equipment, all the desks, all the chairs that we needed to create the task force site.
As well as carrying out his duties, the diligent employee would also show an interest in the ongoing investigation.
He had conversations with our investigators about the homicide victims. Matter of fact, a homicide victim was found one morning when two of the investigators were with Bill, and their pager went off, and Bill made the comment to them, "Oh, did you find another body?"
20 years earlier, Bill Suff had just relocated to Texas to pursue a life in the Air Force. However, his career as an aide in a military hospital hadn't been illustrious.
His military career was essentially unremarkable, certainly not glorious.
I do not know what kind of discharge he got. One day he's in, the next day he's not.
And it would soon become apparent that the newly married Suffs were not headed for wedded bliss.
Bill's relationship with Terrell was one of manipulation, control.
He didn't like me going to the laundromat alone. He didn't like me going grocery shopping alone. He was the one that was supposed to be in charge of everything. Our sex life was, you're ready when I am. I would lay down and do it and be glad.
And Terrell would soon discover more worrying signs from her domineering partner.
We had a kitten, and one night he was meowing and meowing and meowing, and Bill told him to shut up. And the cat just meow, 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 and so he had a little BB gun, and he shot him with a BB gun and killed it. And that scared the bejesus out of me.
Although the arrival of a baby boy was met with Suff's approval, his enthusiasm didn't last.
He was pleased right after the baby was born, but then Billy took up an awful lot of my time. So I couldn't pay total attention to Bill.
Terrell would become increasingly disturbed as her husband's behavior towards their son deteriorated.
He would smack him on the face. I told him, "You don't do that." And he would kind of turn around and look at me, and it was like, oh God, now I'm going to get it.
He had no attachment or no bonding to anybody, including children. It meant nothing to him to beat a child.
He doesn't see them as people. He sees them merely as objects, and very similar to the way he saw his wife. They belong to him. They're his possessions.
Despite Suff's abusive behavior, the couple would have another child. With Terrell working to make ends meet, Suff would become the stay-at-home dad until tragedy struck in 1973.
He called me and said something's wrong with the baby. So I said, I gotta go.
When Terrell arrived back at her flat in Fort Worth, she headed straight for the couple's bedroom.
Dejanay was laying on the bed, and Bill was saying, there's something wrong, she's not breathing, there's something wrong. And I was like, did you call an ambulance? He says, no.
When the emergency services finally arrived on the scene, it would prove too late for the baby girl.
They pronounced Dejanay dead. And Then I found out that my baby had been so abused.
The injuries that the doctors were able to diagnose on Deschanel were extensive, and it indicated chronic physical abuse. Her liver had actually been ruptured by a fist blow to her stomach.
He tried to give the impression that he was upset, but I never saw tears.
A Texas court would sentence Bill Suff to 70 years in prison for the murder of his 2-month-old daughter. "17 years later, in 1991, the posed body of a 6th prostitute, Kathleen Puckett, had been discovered near Lake Elsinore. Police would focus their search on the victim's regular workplace, Riverside City's notorious University Avenue.
I did feel like this is definitely where he selected victims from, because this is where most of the victims came from. Well, I don't think the girls really felt like they were in danger, even though they were warned, spoke to them constantly about protecting themselves. Everybody thinks it can never happen to them, and it happened.
But despite the focus of their investigation, a break in the case would eventually come from out of county. A tip-off in Wisconsin established a prime suspect for the twisted murders that had plagued Riverside for over a year.
We thought that the suspect might be a truck driver because they fit a lot of the profile type of information. Going out there, we felt this is our guy.
It was published in the newspaper that we were all back in the Midwest looking at a suspect in this case.
But as investigators headed out of state, Detective Kears would be forced to return to the back alleys of Riverside City as yet another murder was unveiled.
The body was located over here in the dirt outside the back door here.
And there was no mistaking whose work it was. Riverside's serial killer had struck again.
The body was laid out, nude, exposed.
Her legs were spread out, and her arms were not just randomly dumped.
To expose their genitalia and private areas would be disgusting for a woman to know that somebody has done that to her.
The body would be identified as another prostitute, 24-year-old Cherie Pacer.
Cherie Pacer was a deaf girl, young, sweet.
This was a very sad situation.
As the remainder of the task force returned from the false lead in Wisconsin, police felt there was little doubt that the killer was sending them a very personal message.
He was mad. He was responding to the fact that this task force had gone off and diverted attention from whatever he was doing.
I think he thought, oh, well, I'll show them. I'm right here still.
In 1991, Riverside Police and the Sheriff's Department had formed a task force to hunt a prolific ritualistic killer preying on local prostitutes throughout the county. But as the body count hit 7, the elusive perpetrator remained one step ahead of the authorities.
It was very difficult, this investigation, not knowing when we were going to have the next body, where the body was going to be. As an investigator, I believe serial murder cases were one of the most difficult cases to solve.
Once we had an announcement in the newspaper that a body had been found, it wasn't much longer we'd have another body. So it told me that this guy is just running wild.
"7 years earlier, in 1984, local man Bill Suff had been paroled in Texas, having served just 10 years for the murder of his baby daughter. Newly divorced, the 34-year-old had decided to relocate.
Despite the fact that he was supposed to not leave the jurisdiction, Bill came back to his old stomping grounds, riverside of Lake Elsinore, and just started his life over as if anything wrong that had occurred had been just a big mistake and he was an innocent man.
He was very mild-mannered, he was friendly, he was outgoing, he was helping people, he was your next-door neighbor.
Bill Suff liked to be known as somebody who was standing up for truth, justice, and the American way. And he was going to be there to protect you, certainly to the extent of being someone who was out watching your back when you weren't watching it.
Bill would hold down a variety of jobs in Riverside City and was always keen to get involved in the community.
He won the chili cook-off at the county employees' picnic one year. And the county had a ride-share program, so employees would get together and environmentally do the right thing and commute to and from work together. He was the poster boy with his silver van. He was there smiling on the cover, and the headline said, "Take a ride with Bill."
In 1990, 40-year-old Suff would marry an 18-year-old supermarket girl. His second wife would soon learn there was a very different side to the happy-go-lucky Bill Suff.
He basically was like a boss to her. He just dominated her completely.
She was just pushed around and scared off. He wanted you in a position where you would never dare investigate or ask a question or intrude on him in any way.
Despite his prior conviction for the murder of his child during his first marriage, Bill would father another baby girl.
The problem with adding a child to any Bill Suff relationship is that he's the narcissist, he's the egoist. It's all about him, and it ceases to be when you have a child to take care of.
Increasingly absent from home, Suff would focus his attentions on an issue that he insisted was plaguing the area.
He would go around telling people that there was a problem with the prostitutes and they needed to clean up the area and get rid of the prostitutes.
He would just make raving comments about the prostitutes being a plague upon the city because they're dirty, they carry disease, they discourage other business.
But despite his campaign to have the working girls removed from the streets, Suff was leading a double life that was at odds with his impassioned rhetoric.
In fact, he was partaking of the prostitute services. He was very much two personas in the same body.
And all the time, Bill Suff's secret life would remain hidden.
It's not like he came home with a load of excuses as to why he was gone for hours and hours. He would just simply come home at whatever weird hour it was and go, "Hey, honey, I'm home."
I don't think he wanted to tell anybody about anything of what he was doing or what he was thinking. He had no attachment to adults, to women, to children, to animals, to anything.
Just 6 months later, the ritualistic killer plaguing Riverside County struck again, with the murder of prostitute Kelly Hammond. But this time the elusive perpetrator had slipped up. The victim's best friend had witnessed her being picked up in a silver van.
She told me that he was a white male, probably in his late 40s, who wore glasses. So now we have a color of vehicle, we have a description of an individual. Now we need to find the individual, we need to find the van, and we can tie it all up.
As the task force attempted to close the net around the killer, Bill Suff's nighttime visits to the red light district would remain under the police radar. However, during the day, he would regularly brush shoulders with the law as he handed out police equipment in a county warehouse.
Bill really enjoyed this role because he got to be seen as the boss of the warehouse. They knew he was not the boss, but whenever they wanted anything, they had to go see Bill.
Bill was simultaneously a popular, okay guy, and yet for other people he was that guy who seemed to make you a little bit uncomfortable, but you didn't know why.
Although Bill wasn't employed by the police force, he would take a keen interest in law enforcement in his spare time.
His apartment complex, he always would like to view himself as the protector, as a security guard type of individual. He'd have a jacket that almost looked semi-official.
If people saw him in an odd place, they wouldn't think, oh, what's he doing there? It was like, oh, that's Bill. He's supposed to be in that odd place.
As Suff continued to patrol his neighborhood, Riverside police were desperately chasing up leads following a detailed description of the suspected serial killer. However, Detective Kears was about to experience another unexpected turn to the horrific case.
I made a comment that this particular individual had a specific desire for white women. The chief at that point made a statement indicating that our suspect didn't like African-American females, he liked white girls. And it was after that that we found the body of McDonald.
Catherine McDonald had been a black prostitute, last seen working Riverside's University Avenue.
The publication in the paper, I think, drove our suspect to say, I can get an African American, I don't need to just get whites, I'll show you.
Part of that is disdain. They think they're superior to the investigators, but also it's a feeling of, I'm the one in charge, I'm the dominant person here, I'll make decisions about what I do or don't do.
Worryingly, the killer's change of MO appeared to be partnered by an increased level of violence.
Her breast was removed, which was one of his traits, but she also had additional stab marks. The wounds on her were so severe and so violent that she was almost decapitated.
And the killer's heinous crimes were becoming more frequent.
Because of the manner in which these homicides were occurring now at an exponential rate, we became more concerned.
Once you get the taste of blood like that and you're a serial murderer, you're going to continue doing it.
In 1991, a Riverside task force finally had the description of a man suspected of murdering at least 11 innocent women. But as police tried to close the net around the elusive killer, the hunt was becoming increasingly desperate.
We had to catch him. We had no choice. He wasn't going to stop, obviously. Matter of fact, he was expediting his rate of kill.
We had bodies all over the county. We were on this thing 24/7.
As they continued to be targeted, Detective Kears would stay close to the working girls on the street.
I would talk to the girls, build up that rapport with the women that were out there working so that they would trust me, that they would call me if something happened, that they knew that it wasn't just about catching a murderer, it was about helping them.
The detective had built up a particularly close relationship with 39-year-old Eleanor Cazares.
Eleanor Cazares and I got along very well. Eleanor was sweet, soft, just a gentle person. It was such a difference from her family background.
As the festive season approached, Eleanor would continue to work University Avenue, despite the fact that a serial killer was on the loose. Just 2 days before Christmas, he would strike again. As usual, police would discover a meticulously posed body when they attended the murder scene in a suburb of Riverside City.
An upper-class area, so rather interesting.
The condition of her body was displayed. Some of her fingernails were broken, and her body had been moved from one spot to another.
The killer's trademark brutality was also plain to see. The victim had been horrifically mutilated her breast cut off and thrown away from the corpse.
I wanted to move the hair off of her face so I could see who it was. And that's when I moved the hair, and it was Eleanor.
An autopsy would later reveal that Eleanor Casares had been murdered and dumped in broad daylight by the increasingly brazen killer.
When I saw who it was, I was very, very upset.
I just felt sick inside that this happened on my watch. I felt really responsible to get this solved and get it solved immediately.
And Eleanor's death might just provide the key to unlock the sordid case.
There was a lot of evidence here. I was able to determine that the perpetrator had actually backed up into the place where he stopped. I was able to tell the investigators exactly what tires that we were looking for.
Unusually, none of the tires on the killer's vehicle were of the same make.
How many people drive around with 4 different types of tires on their vehicle? That's very unique and unusual to begin with.
Police now had detailed information on the van and an eyewitness description of their prime suspect. The task force was placed on high alert to catch the prolific killer before he struck again.
The plan was that if anybody stopped a vehicle and the individual driving it matched the description, they were to call me.
It would not be long before a traffic officer pulled over a silver van for an unauthorized U-turn in the red light district of University Avenue.
He looked inside the van and saw a green blanket which matched a lot of the fibers. He saw rope in the van as well.
When she got the call, Detective Kears had just one question for the patrolman.
Look down and tell me what the driver's side front tire brand was.
And when I asked them to go to the passenger side and give me the brand of that tire, that's when I said, okay, I'm en route.
Christine arrived at the scene and was finally confronted with the man she had been hunting for over a year. 41-year-old Bill Suff.
I looked at him and I was rather shocked that he was so plain looking. Very calm, spoke very softly. Didn't look like somebody that could commit the atrocious acts.
At that point in time, he was arrested and brought to the station.
My family was contacted by a detective, and they said, we got him. And there was a huge ripple of relief that went through my family. And for every family that was involved in that case.
But despite his arrest, Suff remained unperturbed until Detective Kears steered the questioning to the recent murder of Eleanor Casares.
I leaned forward to him and I said to him, you were in the orange groves.
His attitude then did a complete change, a 180.
He said that when he was out picking oranges, that he ran across this body and there was a knife in her and he pulled the knife out. And then he made a spontaneous statement of, and I didn't cut her breast off. I never even asked him about that.
Despite Suff's claims of innocence, a search of his van and home would unearth damning evidence.
We found what we characterized as trophies or souvenirs, personal items belonging to the victims. Matter of fact, some of the victims had jewelry that he had taken off the victims' bodies and given to his girlfriend.
3 years later, in 1995, Paul Zellerbach would lead the case against Bill Suff.
Well, I had charged him with committing 13 murders of the prostitutes. We believe he probably murdered 20 to 25 victims.
The victims' families would play a significant role in the ongoing trial.
And the mothers and the sisters and the children got to testify during the penalty phase. I took pride in demonstrating to the jury that these weren't just prostitutes.
Despite an overwhelming case against him, Suff would continue to plead his innocence.
Prosecutor Zellerbach and the news media have all painted a grotesque picture of me as a cold-blooded, heartless monster. They couldn't have been more wrong about me. I am a caring, loving, and helpful person. Ask anyone who was close to me.
In August 1995, Bill Suff was found guilty of 12 murders.
The jury returned a death verdict, and ultimately he was sentenced to death 12 times.
Although the brutal killer was safely off the streets, many were left wondering why he had waged his vengeful campaign against Riverside's working women.
He was bitter, very bitter, and a lot of that was towards women. I had a domineering mother. Your wife leaves you in prison, divorces you. Women are always doing something wrong to you.
In his mind, the prostitutes would represent just the lowest of all possible females. At the same time, because he can pay them and tell them what to do, they're also objects to be controlled.
But were Bill Suff's brutal actions the inevitable result of the troubled path he trod? Or was he born to kill?
It's hard for me to say someone was really a born killer, but he certainly had a lot of predisposition.
I think he was born with this tendency to violence and cruelty, and he actually had that within him. But so do a lot of people, and they don't act on it, and they never do anything with it.
Something triggered his actions that allowed all the past upbringings and challenges to surface.
Maybe our marriage breaking up might have sparked it. Killing Dejanay might have sparked a little fire, and then it had 10 years to burn in prison in Texas.
For many, the memory of Suff's murderous campaign has finally faded. But some will never forget the vulnerable women who lost their lives.
When I reflect on my mom and remember her memories, I smile. I don't really dwell on a lot of that negativity. My life now, I try to live with honor, be trustworthy, and set a good example. And that honors her memory, because I'm her son.
For nearly 23 years, one question haunted Idaho Falls. Who killed Angie Dodge? On June 13th, 1996, 21-year-old Angie Dodge was found murdered inside her apartment at 444 I Street. Investigators recovered biological evidence from the scene, including semen and skin cell evidence, but the identity of the offender remained unknown. The case would eventually lead to the wrongful conviction of Christopher Tapp, a man who was imprisoned for years despite DNA evidence ultimately excluding him before a revolutionary genetic genealogy investigation pointed detectives toward Brian Lee Dripp. In May 2019, authorities announced that Dripps had been identified as the source of the suspect DNA, and court documents state that he later confessed to the rape and murder and said he acted alone. The story begins not with the arrest, not with the DNA breakthrough, and not with the confession, but with an ordinary Idaho morning that became the beginning of one of the state's most painful cold cases. Because Angie Dodge was not supposed to become a headline, she was supposed to live another day, make plans, see friends, and continue building a life that had barely begun. But on that June morning, the normal rhythm of Idaho Falls was shattered when Angie was discovered dead inside her apartment, and investigators immediately faced a crime scene that suggested a brutal attack. Yet the most important clue was invisible to the naked eye: biological evidence left behind by the person responsible, evidence that would remain preserved while the investigation around it changed dramatically over the following decades. Investigators collected the evidence and began searching for answers, but the killer was already disappearing into the ordinary population. There was no immediate arrest, no confession, and no obvious suspect who could explain why Angie had been targeted. the case became a race between investigators and time had an advantage because every day that passed made memories less reliable and witnesses harder to locate. But the biological evidence remained, and that evidence would eventually become the thread connecting three different eras of the investigation: the original homicide inquiry, the wrongful conviction of Christopher Tapp, and the modern genetic genealogy breakthrough that finally identified Brian Drips. At first, however, none of that was known. Investigators were working with the technology and assumptions of 1996, and the DNA recovered from the scene pointed toward an unknown male, but a database search did not immediately produce the answer. The profile existed, yet the person behind it did not have a name, and that created the central mystery. Someone had left biological evidence at Angie's apartment, someone whose identity remained beyond the reach of conventional investigation, and without a suspect, detectives began searching through the people connected to Angie and the surrounding community, looking for a motive, an opportunity, or a relationship that could explain the crime. As the investigation progressed, attention eventually turned toward Christopher Tapp, and what followed would become one of the most consequential chapters in the case. Tapp was questioned, eventually convicted in 1998 of first-degree murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon during a felony, receiving a sentence that included life imprisonment, and his conviction was affirmed by the Idaho Supreme Court in 2000. But beneath the conviction, a critical problem remained. The DNA evidence did not establish that Tapp was the man who had left the biological evidence at the crime scene, and over time, questions surrounding the investigation and Tapp's conviction became impossible to ignore. The case had apparently been solved, yet the scientific evidence was pointing somewhere else, and that contradiction would eventually become the key to reopening the entire story. Because DNA is different from a confession or an eyewitness memory. It can provide a biological connection that investigators can test, compare, and verify. And the DNA recovered from Angie's murder scene represented a direct physical connection to the unknown offender. If the profile could be connected to a real person, the decades-old mystery could finally be resolved. But for years, that connection remained invisible. Then forensic science changed, and with it came a new investigative method that had already begun transforming cold cases across the United States: investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that combines DNA analysis with genealogical research to generate investigative leads, allowing detectives to search through genetic relationships rather than simply looking for an exact match in a criminal database. Idaho State Police now describes investigative genetic genealogy as a tool increasingly used to identify unidentified remains and help solve cold case homicides and sexual assault. The idea was revolutionary because the killer did not need to have his own DNA sitting inside a police database. He might never have been arrested, never have been convicted, and never have voluntarily submitted a sample. Yet, if biological relatives appeared in a genealogy database, investigators could potentially build a family tree that moved closer and closer to the unknown contributor, and that is what changed the Angie Dodge investigation. The old DNA profile was no longer trapped inside the limitations of the 1990s. It could now be examined using technology that had not existed when Angie was killed, and suddenly the evidence had somewhere to go. Investigators could search not only for the killer himself, but for his genetic relatives, and that meant the investigation could reach beyond the person who had committed the crime. It could move through generations, across family branches, and eventually toward a living individual. The process required patience and careful analysis because a genetic relationship does not automatically identify a murderer. It creates a lead that must be investigated and corroborated. But for a case that had remained unresolved for more than 2 decades, even a lead was extraordinary. Investigators eventually narrowed their attention toward Brian Lee Drips, a man living in Caldwell, Idaho, and the investigation then moved from genealogy to direct forensic confirmation. According to Idaho State Police records, investigators connected drips to the case through groundbreaking DNA testing and molecular genealogy in May 2019, and court documents state that DNA recovered from a cigarette, but associated with drips, matched the DNA profile from semen left on Angie's body. That tiny piece of evidence changed everything because suddenly the unknown DNA profile had a name attached to it. And the name was not Christopher Tapp, the man who had spent years imprisoned for a crime the genetic evidence now pointed away from him. It was Brian Drips, and when investigators interviewed him, court documents state that he admitted to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge, saying that he had acted alone and that he did not know Christopher Tapp or ever meet him. The revelation was devastating because it meant the original investigation had taken a wrong turn. A man had been convicted while the actual perpetrator remained free, and the DNA that could have pointed toward the truth had been sitting in the evidence all along, waiting for technology to catch up with it. This was not simply the solving of an old murder. It was the exposure of a profound failure in the original pursuit of justice, because every year that passed while the wrong man remained behind bars was another year in which the real killer remained outside prison, living a life that investigators now had to examine through the lens of a crime committed decades earlier. The story became even more extraordinary because the breakthrough did not come from a dramatic confession delivered out of nowhere. It came from the convergence of old evidence and new science. The DNA had survived. The genetic information could be analyzed. Genealogists could trace the biological connections. Investigators could identify a person of interest, and a direct DNA comparison could then establish whether the genealogical lead was correct. It was the kind of chain that investigators in 1996 could not have imagined, and yet the original evidence had been waiting for exactly this kind of future. Angie had been killed in a case that initially seemed to have no answer. Then the investigation produced a conviction, but the conviction did not end the mystery because the real answer was still hiding in the DNA, and for years that answer remained inaccessible, not because it was absent, but because the technology needed to interpret it had not yet arrived. When that technology finally appeared, the case changed almost overnight. The unknown man became a name. The name became a suspect, and the suspect became a confession. But the consequences extended beyond Brian Dripp because Christopher Tapp's story had to be reconsidered, his conviction had to be challenged, and the justice system had to confront the possibility that it had imprisoned the wrong person. Official Idaho documents record that Tapp's later post-conviction proceedings were based on new evidence asserting his actual innocence, including the identification of Drips as the source of the suspect DNA. The case had therefore become two stories at once, one about Angie Dodge and the search for her killer, and another about Christopher Tapp and the consequences of a wrongful conviction, both stories connected by the same microscopic evidence, DNA, that had remained consistent while human interpretations around it changed. And that is what makes the Angie Dodge case so haunting, because the evidence never forgot what happened. People did. Investigations failed. Memories changed. Suspects were misidentified, years disappeared, but the biological trace remained, silent and patient, waiting for science to ask the right question. And when investigators finally did, the answer was powerful enough to rewrite the entire history of the case. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Angie Dodge was killed. But the killer had not escaped the evidence. He had only escaped the technology of the time, and when that technology caught up with him, the mystery that had seemed almost permanent suddenly had a face, a name, and a confession. The name Brian Drips did not suddenly appear from nowhere. It emerged from a trail of evidence that had been waiting for the right technology, and that distinction matters because the Angie Dodge case was not solved by luck, and it was not solved by a single detective suddenly remembering an overlooked detail. It was solved because investigators returned to evidence that had survived from 1996 and asked a question that earlier generations of investigators could not have asked in the same way. If the unknown DNA profile could not be matched directly to a person, could it be connected to that person's relative? That question changed the entire direction of the investigation because conventional DNA databases work most effectively when the person responsible has already been identified through a previous criminal case, or has otherwise entered the system. But the unknown offender in Angie's murder had apparently provided investigators with that direct connection, meaning the DNA profile existed without a name, a biological signature without an identity, and for years, that was where the investigation stopped. The evidence could say that an unknown male had contributed biological material, but it could not say who that male was. And as the years passed, that limitation became increasingly frustrating, especially because the case had already taken a devastating turn. Christopher Tapp had been convicted, yet questions about the DNA evidence continued to cast doubt over the conclusion. Tapp's conviction had depended heavily on an investigation that eventually became deeply controversial, and the biological evidence did not support the conclusion that he was the source of the semen recovered from Angie. The science had never changed, but the interpretation surrounding it had, and eventually that contradiction became impossible to ignore. Tapp spent years behind bars while the actual offender remained unidentified, and Angie Dodge's family continued to live with the knowledge that the man responsible for her death had never truly been found. Then the world of forensic investigation began changing. Genetic genealogy was proving that DNA could reveal relationships even when there was no direct database match, and investigators recognized that an unidentified offender could potentially be located through his family tree. The principle was both simple and extraordinary. Relatives share portions of their DNA, and if a distant relative of an unknown offender had voluntarily placed genetic information into a genealogy database, investigators might be able to use that relationship to work backward toward the source. The process was not instantaneous, and it did not mean that investigators could simply type a name into a computer and receive the identity of a murderer. Instead, researchers had to examine genetic matches, construct family trees, compare generations, identify branches, eliminate unrelated lines, and gradually narrow the possibilities. And in a case that had remained unresolved for more than 20 years, that painstaking process offered something the original investigation never had: a path beyond the walls of the conventional criminal database. The unknown suspect did not have to be sitting inside a police file, because his relatives might be sitting inside a genealogy database, and that meant the investigation could move through the family rather than directly through the offender. This was the tiny opening that eventually became enormous. And as investigators pursued the genetic genealogy lead, attention turned toward Brian Dripps, a man whose connection to the DNA evidence would eventually be tested directly. But before that happened, investigators needed to establish whether the genealogical lead was more than a theoretical possibility, because a family tree connection is not the same thing as proof. It is an investigative direction, a way of saying that one particular family line may contain the person who contributed the unknown DNA. And once that possibility was identified, investigators could conduct additional surveillance and collect discarded DNA from a potential suspect. A cigarette but became critical, according to Idaho State Police records, because DNA obtained from a cigarette but associated with Dripps matched the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. And that direct comparison transformed a genealogical lead into forensic evidence. The microscopic trace recovered decades earlier had finally been connected to a living person, and suddenly the mystery surrounding Angie's murder had a specific target: Brian Lee Dripp. But investigators still had to proceed carefully, because identifying the source of DNA was one step. Proving what happened inside Angie's apartment was another. The DNA established a biological connection, but investigators needed to understand the circumstances surrounding the crime and determine whether Dripps was responsible for the murder itself, and that was where the case became even more extraordinary, because according to court records, when investigators questioned Dripps, he confessed to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and stated that he had acted alone. He also said he did not know Christopher Tapp and had never met him, a statement that directly challenged the conviction that had kept Tapp in prison for years. Suddenly, the original narrative began collapsing because the DNA belonged to someone else. The suspect had confessed, and the person who had been convicted could now point to scientific evidence supporting his claim that he had not committed the crime. The case was no longer simply a cold case solved by DNA. It had become a demonstration of how forensic science could both identify the true offender and expose a wrongful conviction, and for investigators, that meant returning to the original case with a much more critical eye, because every piece of evidence now had to be understood in light of what was known about drip, tap, and the DNA. The question was no longer whether the biological evidence belonged to an unknown male. It was whether the entire sequence of events could be reconstructed around the person whose DNA had finally been identified. And that reconstruction mattered deeply to Angie's family, because for years had lived with the uncertainty surrounding her death. And then they had watched another man be convicted, while the biological evidence continued pointing towards someone else. The eventual identification of Drips did not erase those years. It did not undo the damage caused by the wrongful conviction, and it could not return Angie to the life she had lost. But it finally answered one of the most painful questions in the case. Who had left the biological evidence behind? The answer was Brian Drip, and investigators now had the ability to connect him directly to the crime seen through DNA. The science had effectively reached backward across more than 2 decades and placed his identity beside evidence collected in 1996. A remarkable example of how preserved forensic evidence can outlive investigative assumption, because the evidence had not become more truthful in 2019 than it had been in 1996. It had simply become more accessible. The DNA profile was always what it was, but investigators in the 1990s did not possess the genealogical tools that later allowed them to interpret it. And that difference is central to understanding why the case remained unsolved for so long. The killer had not necessarily escaped because he was invisible. He escaped because investigators did not yet know how to read the trail he left behind. And when the technology finally developed, the trail became readable. But the breakthrough also raised a painful question. How many other cases might contain evidence that investigators have not yet learned how to interpret? The Angie Dodge investigation became a powerful example of why old evidence should be preserved, because a biological sample that seems limited today may become extremely valuable tomorrow. Forensic science is constantly changing, and what cannot be tested effectively at one moment may become testable years later. The same principle had already transformed Angie's case once, and investigators could not ignore what that meant for other unsolved murders. Meanwhile, the legal consequences of the discovery were unfolding rapidly. Christopher Tapp's conviction could no longer stand comfortably beside the new DNA evidence, because if Drips was the source of the biological material and had confessed to the murder, the case against Tapp became fundamentally incompatible with the scientific evidence. The justice system had to confront the reality that a wrongful conviction had occurred, and Tapp's years in prison became part of the story rather than an isolated footnote. He had lost years of his life because investigators had reached the wrong conclusion, and the true offender had remained free. The revelation was therefore both a victory and a warning. A victory because the killer had finally been identified, and a warning because the original investigation had demonstrated how dangerous it can be when a confession, investigative theory, and forensic evidence are not properly reconciled. The DNA had ultimately provided the independent truth that the case needed, and once that truth became undeniable, the entire structure surrounding the original conviction began to change. For Angie Dodge's family, however, the most important fact remained brutally simple. Angie was still gone. No forensic breakthrough could change that. No arrest could restore the years stolen from her family, and no courtroom could erase the violence that had ended her life. But identifying the killer mattered because it transformed an unanswered question into an established fact. The person responsible was no longer a shadow, no longer an unknown genetic profile, no longer a figure hidden somewhere beyond the reach of investigators. He had a name, and that name had been connected to the crime through science. The very evidence that had once seemed unable to solve the case had eventually become the strongest path toward the truth. And the story of the cigarette but was particularly striking because it showed how something discarded and apparently insignificant could become one of the most important pieces of evidence. In a decades-old murder investigation, a cigarette tossed away without thought became a bridge between the present and a crime seen from 23 years earlier, and that bridge allowed investigators to compare Drips's DNA with the DNA recovered from Angie. The result was a match, and with that match, the investigation crossed a line it had been unable to cross for decades, from uncertainty into identification, from theory into evidence, and from an unknown offender into a named suspect. Yet even after the scientific breakthrough, the emotional weight of the case remained, because solving a murder does not mean repairing every consequence of the murder. It means establishing the truth and holding the responsible person accountable, and in this case, accountability had to exist alongside the painful recognition that another man had already paid the price for a crime he did not commit. The case, therefore, became more than a story about a killer who was finally caught. It became a story about what happens when old evidence survives long enough for new science to reveal what investigators could not see before. It became a story about the fragility of memory, the danger of wrongful conviction, and the extraordinary persistence of forensic evidence. And above all, it became the story of Angie Dodge, whose name had remained connected to an unsolved murder for years while the truth waited inside a tiny biological trace, a trace that had no voice, no face, and no explanation until investigators finally learned how to make it speak. The discovery that Brian Drips was the source of the DNA changed the Angie Dodge investigation, but it also forced investigators to confront an uncomfortable truth. The case had not simply gone cold. It had gone wrong. For years, Christopher Tapp had been the man associated with Angie's murder, while the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene belonged to someone else. On May 16, 2019, authorities publicly announced that investigators had positively identified Drips as the source of the suspect DNA recovered from the evidence collected at Angie's apartment in Idaho Falls in 1996. The announcement was explosive. A case that had seemed trapped in the past suddenly had a new suspect, and the man already convicted was now at the center of a different question. How had the investigation ever come to focus on him? To understand the significance of the breakthrough, investigators had to go back to the beginning, to the hours after Angie Dodge was found dead, when detectives entered a crime scene that would eventually become one of the most important forensic investigations in Idaho. Angie was 21 years old. Her life had been cut short inside her own apartment, and investigators immediately began collecting physical evidence. Among the most important discoveries were biological traces that could later be tested for DNA. At the time, however, forensic DNA technology was still developing. Investigators could preserve evidence, but the ability to extract, compare, and interpret genetic information was far more limited than it would become decades later. The DNA profile recovered from Angie's case eventually established the presence of an unknown male, but a conventional database search did not identify him. The profile existed. The person did not. That distinction would haunt the investigation. When investigators later focused on Christopher Tapp, the case moved toward prosecution, and in May 1998, a jury found Tapp guilty. In December of that year, he was sentenced to life plus additional prison time, along with sentences for rape and use of a deadly weapon during a felony. His conviction was affirmed by the Idaho Supreme Court in 2000. On paper, the case appeared to have reached its conclusion, but the DNA evidence remained an unresolved contradiction. The unknown male profile from the crime scene had not disappeared simply because a jury had convicted someone else. It remained exactly where it had always been, inside the evidence, and that created a question that would become more important with every passing year. If Tapp was the killer, why did the biological evidence point to another man? The answer eventually became devastating. Tapp was not the source of the crime scene DNA. The person whose DNA had been recovered from Angie was still free, and while Tapp remained imprisoned, investigators continued searching for a way to identify that unknown man. The case became a battle between old investigative methods and new forensic science. Traditional DNA databases could search for a direct match, but most people were not included in those databases. Idaho State Police later explained that forensic investigative genetic genealogy could approach the problem differently by using genealogical information from consenting individuals in public access databases to generate investigative leads, after which investigators could compare a potential suspect's DNA directly with the crime scene sample. That distinction was critical. The technology did not magically name a murderer. It created a pathway toward one. Instead of asking, where is this exact DNA profile already stored? Investigators could ask, what relatives might share enough DNA with this unknown person to help us identify his family? The investigation could move outward before moving inward. A distant relative could become the first clue. A family tree could become the map. And eventually, that map could lead investigators toward one specific individual. This was the new world of forensic genetic genealogy, and Angie Dodge's case would become one of its most powerful examples. The unknown DNA profile was no longer trapped inside the limits of CODIS. It could potentially be compared with genetic information voluntarily uploaded to genealogy databases. Researchers could search for relatives, examine family structures, identify common ancestors, and eliminate branches that did not fit. It was detective work conducted through genetics, but it required extraordinary patience because a genetic relative could be distant. The family tree could be enormous, and historical records could contain error. Researchers had to verify relationships rather than simply assume them. A single incorrect branch could send the entire investigation in the wrong direction. Yet the possibility was revolutionary. For the first time, investigators had a realistic method for identifying someone who had never been arrested, never been convicted, and never placed his DNA into a criminal database. And the man they were looking for had precisely that advantage. He had remained outside the system. He had not been directly matched. He had not been identified by traditional investigative method. For decades, the absence of a match had helped him remain invisible. Genetic genealogy changed the meaning of that absence. The fact that his DNA was not already in a law enforcement database no longer meant the investigation had reached a dead end. His relatives might be enough. Eventually, investigators developed a lead that pointed toward Brian Lee Drips of Caldwell, Idaho, but a genealogical lead was not enough. The investigators needed direct confirmation. That confirmation came through DNA obtained from a cigarette but associated with Drips. Idaho State Police reported that the DNA from the cigarette but matched the DNA profile from semen left on Angie's body. That moment transformed the investigation. The unknown biological profile recovered in 1996 now had a confirmed identity. The evidence had crossed 23 years of time and connected a living man to the crime scene. But the investigation did not stop there. Detectives still had to establish what Drips knew, what he had done, and whether he would admit responsibility. According to court documents, he did. After investigators confronted him with the evidence, Drips confessed to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge. He reportedly told investigators that he acted alone and that he did not know Christopher Tapp or have any relationship with him. The confession was devastating because it changed the meaning of everything that had happened since 1996. Tapp's conviction was no longer merely questionable. It had become incompatible with the emerging evidence. If Drips was the source of the biological evidence and was admitting responsibility for the murder, then the man who had spent years in prison for the crime was facing a profound injustice. Tapp's legal team moved to challenge his conviction based on the new evidence, and prosecutors ultimately agreed that the conviction should be vacated. On July 26, 2019, the court vacated and dismissed Tapp's conviction based on actual innocence. The words actual innocence carried enormous weight. This was not simply a technical reversal or a procedural correction. The court recognized that Tapp had not committed the crimes for which he had been convicted. The man who had spent years behind bars was innocent of Angie's murder, and the person responsible had finally been identified. The case had therefore produced two dramatically different outcomes from the same piece of evidence. The DNA that ultimately pointed toward Drips also helped demonstrate that Tapp was not the source of the biological material. The same scientific evidence that had once been unable to solve the crime had eventually become the strongest argument against the wrongful conviction. It was a reminder that evidence does not become less important because investigators initially misunderstand it. Sometimes the evidence simply waits for someone to interpret it correctly. For Angie Dodge's family, however, the breakthrough could not erase the years of uncertainty. Nothing could change the fact that Angie had been killed in 1996. Nothing could return the years in which her family did not know who was responsible. And nothing could restore the time Christopher Tapp had lost while imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. The case had become a tragedy layered upon tragedy. A young woman was murdered. Her killer remained free. Another man was convicted. Decades passed. Then science finally exposed the truth. The story also demonstrated why preserving evidence matters so profoundly in unsolved homicide investigation. Idaho State Police now describes forensic investigative genetic genealogy as an increasingly important tool for solving cold case homicides and sexual assaults, and the agency's modern cold case program specifically supports DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and other advanced forensic methods. In Angie's case, the biological evidence collected decades earlier became more powerful as technology improved. The investigators of 1996 could not have known exactly what future scientists would be able to do with that evidence. They could only collect it, preserve it, and hope that one day it might reveal something. That day eventually came. The breakthrough was not a miracle. It was the result of evidence preservation, technological development, genealogical research, laboratory testing, and traditional police work converging after years of failure, and that is what made the case so extraordinary. The killer had not been discovered because someone suddenly remembered his face. He had not been identified because he voluntarily stepped forward. He had been identified because his genetic identity was hiding in a network of biological relationships that investigators could finally analyze. For nearly 3 decades, the offender had existed in the world as an ordinary person while the case remained unresolved. He could change addresses. He could grow older. He could lie through birthdays and holidays. He could watch the years pass, but the DNA he left behind could not change. It remained tied to the crime scene, and eventually science built a bridge between that evidence and his identity. The arrest, therefore, represented more than the end of a cold case. It represented the collapse of a decades-long illusion of safety. The killer had not escaped the evidence. He had only escaped the investigators who did not yet possess the tools to interpret it. And once those tools arrived, the past became impossible to hide. Angie Dodge finally had a name attached to the person responsible for her death. Christopher Tapp finally had the scientific evidence necessary to clear his name, and investigators had demonstrated that a crime committed in the 1990s could still be solved in the modern era. But one question remained emotionally impossible to ignore. How many years might have been different if the technology available in 2019 had existed in 1996? The answer could never be known. What could be known was that the evidence had been there from the beginning. It had been collected. It had been preserved. It had waited. And after more than 2 decades, it finally spoke. The DNA match did more than identify Brian Drips. It forced the entire history of the Angie Dodge case into a new light because once investigators knew whose biological material had been recovered from the crime scene, they could no longer look at the earlier investigation as a finished story. Every assumption had to be reconsidered. Every interrogation had to be examined. Every conclusion had to be measured against the forensic evidence that had survived longer than the original theory. For Christopher Tapp, that meant the discovery was not simply the solution to someone else's murder. It was the evidence that could finally prove what he had been saying for years. He had not killed Angie Dodge. The DNA belonged to another man, and that man, Brian Drips, had ultimately confessed. The significance of that revelation reached far beyond the courtroom. It exposed how a homicide investigation can become locked onto one theory while the most important evidence points in another direction. And it demonstrated why cold cases sometimes require investigators to step backward before they can move forward. In Angie's case, moving forward meant returning to the physical evidence collected in 1996 and allowing modern science to challenge conclusions that had once seemed settled. The original investigation had been conducted in a different forensic era. DNA testing was already transforming criminal investigations, but the tools available to detectives were nowhere near as powerful as the technology that would emerge decades later. Genetic genealogy was not yet part of the investigative vocabulary. Public genealogy databases capable of connecting distant biological relatives were not being used to identify murder suspects. Advanced methods for extracting information from degraded or limited biological material were still developing. Investigators could preserve evidence, but they could not always extract everything that evidence contained. That difference became the defining feature of Angie's case. The biological evidence existed in 1996. The ability to interpret its full significance came much later. The crime itself had never changed. The killer's DNA had never changed. What changed was the scientific language used to read that DNA. For decades, investigators had essentially been staring at a locked door. The key existed somewhere, but nobody had invented it yet. Then forensic genetic genealogy arrived, and suddenly the door could open. The method was especially powerful in cases where a suspect had never been arrested or had no DNA profile in a criminal database. Instead of requiring a direct match, investigators could search for relatives of the unknown DNA contributor and reconstruct family relationships until a likely individual emerged. But that process required enormous caution. A genetic connection could point toward a family, but it could not by itself prove murder. Investigators had to establish identity, obtain a direct DNA sample, compare it with the original evidence, and then investigate the person's connection to the crime. In Angie's case, the process eventually led investigators to Brian Drip. The direct comparison was decisive. DNA obtained from a cigarette but associated with Drip's matched the DNA profile recovered from the crime scene. ISP.idaho.gov. The tiny piece of discarded material had become the bridge between a man living in Idaho decades later and evidence collected from Angie in 1996. It was a startling reminder that evidence does not need to look important to be important. A cigarette, but can appear worthless. A strand of biological material can appear insignificant. A trace collected from a crime scene can disappear into a storage box for decades. But if that evidence contains DNA, its value can increase dramatically as science advances. That was exactly what happened here. The cigarette, but did not solve the case by itself. It confirmed the identity produced by the genealogical investigation. The two methods reinforced one another. Genetic genealogy created the investigative lead. Direct DNA comparison provided the forensic confirmation. Together, they transformed an unknown genetic profile into a named individual, and then came the confession. According to official documents, Drips admitted to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and stated that he acted alone. He also said that he did not know Christopher Tapp and had never met him. TransparencyResources.idaho.gov. Those statements had enormous implications. For years, the case had contained an established narrative surrounding Tapp. Now the biological evidence and Drips's own statements contradicted that narrative. The investigation had to acknowledge that the original conviction had been wrong. The courts eventually did exactly that. Tapp's conviction was vacated and dismissed on July 26, 2019, after the new evidence demonstrated his actual innocence. SCO.idaho.gov. The reversal was extraordinary, but it was also deeply painful. A wrongful conviction is not simply a legal error written into a file. It changes a person's life. It takes away years that cannot be recovered. It separates people from their families and community. It places a permanent burden on the person who has been wrongly accused. In Tapp's case, the DNA that eventually exposed the real killer also became part of the evidence that exposed the failure of the original prosecution. The same science had two consequences. It identified the offender and helped free the innocent man. That dual role made the Angie Dodge case one of the most important examples of modern forensic investigation. But for Angie's family, the legal correction could never completely repair the damage. Angie was still dead. Her family had still endured years without knowing who was responsible. The person responsible had still spent more than 2 decades outside prison, while another man suffered the consequences of the original investigation. Justice had finally begun moving in the right direction, but it had taken far too long, and the reason it took so long was not simply that investigators lacked evidence. They had evidence. What they lacked was the ability to connect that evidence to the person who left it behind. That distinction is easy to miss when looking at a solved case from the present. Once the killer's name is known, it can seem obvious that the evidence should always have led there. But investigations do not work backward. Detectives cannot begin with the answer and search for supporting evidence. They begin with uncertainty. They work with incomplete information, imperfect memories, limited technology, and enormous pressure to find a suspect. In 1996, investigators did not know that genetic genealogy would eventually transform cold case investigations. They did not know that a relative of the killer might someday appear in a public database. They did not know that discarded DNA from a cigarette could be used to confirm an identity more than 2 decades later. They were working with what they had. But the consequences of getting the wrong person were enormous. That is why the Angie Dodge case became such a powerful reminder of the importance of independent forensic evidence. A confession can be questioned. A witness can be mistaken. A theory can be wrong. DNA, when properly collected, tested, interpreted, and corroborated, can provide an independent line of evidence capable of overturning an established narrative. The case also highlighted the extraordinary potential of forensic genetic genealogy for unresolved crime. Idaho State Police has described genetic genealogy as an emerging tool that can help identify unknown offenders and unidentified remains, and the agency has expanded its cold case work to include advanced DNA methods. ISP.idaho.gov. The Angie Dodge investigation showed why that mattered. An offender does not necessarily have to be in a criminal database for his DNA to become useful. His relatives can create a pathway. His family history can become evidence. His genetic connections can reveal what traditional searches could not. The technology effectively changed the boundaries of the investigation. Before genetic genealogy, detectives were searching for a man. After genetic genealogy, they could search for his family. That was a profound change. It meant that the suspect's biological identity could potentially be reconstructed, even if the suspect himself had never interacted with law enforcement. And once investigators narrowed the family tree sufficiently, they could move back into traditional police work and test the specific suspect. The technology did not replace detective work. It expanded it. It gave investigators a new map. The rest still required careful investigation. The final identification of drips therefore represented a convergence of old and new methods. The old evidence came from Angie's apartment. The modern technology came from genetic genealogy. The direct confirmation came from DNA collected from drips. The confession provided another crucial piece of the case, and the legal process ultimately recognized the consequences for TAP. Each piece strengthened the others. That is what made the conclusion possible. Without the original biological evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without modern genetic genealogy, there might have been no pathway to drip. Without the direct comparison, the genealogical lead would have remained only a lead. Without the confession and additional investigation, the case would still have required further legal development. And without the court's recognition of the new evidence, TAP's wrongful conviction might not have been corrected as quickly. The chain mattered. Every link mattered. And the most haunting part was that the first link had existed since the night Angie died. It had been waiting inside the evidence while investigators, prosecutors, defense attorneys, scientists, and eventually genealogists tried to understand what had happened. Time had not erased the truth. It had hidden it behind the limits of technology. The killer could move on. The investigation could slow down. Headlines could disappear. Detectives could retire. But the DNA remained. It did not forget. It did not age in the same way human memory aged. It simply waited. And eventually, someone asked the right question. Could this unknown DNA belong to a man whose relatives had unknowingly placed the pathway to him inside a genealogy database? The answer changed everything. It turned a cold case into an active investigation. It turned an unknown profile into a family tree. It turned a family tree into a suspect. It turned a suspect into a DNA match. And it ultimately turned a decades-old mystery into a case with a name attached to the offender. Yet even after that extraordinary breakthrough, another question remained, one that could not be answered by DNA alone. What exactly happened inside Angie's apartment on that June day in 1996? The DNA could tell investigators who had left biological material behind. The confession could provide an account. But reconstructing the sequence of events required looking at the crime itself, the evidence collected at the scene, the investigative decisions made afterward, and the years of uncertainty that followed. Somewhere inside those details was the full story of how Angie Dodge died and how the investigation lost its way before finally finding the truth. And that story was about to become even more disturbing because the discovery of the real killer did not simply close an old case. It reopened every question surrounding the man who had been convicted before him. The moment Brian Dripps became the focus of the investigation, the Angie Dodge case stopped being a story about an unidentified killer and became a story about consequences, because identifying the real offender meant confronting everything that had happened while he remained unknown. For investigators, the task was no longer simply to prove that Dripps's DNA matched the biological evidence. That scientific connection was powerful, but the full case required understanding how the crime had unfolded, what investigators had believed in 1996, why Christopher Tapp had been convicted, and how the new evidence dismantled that conclusion. The more investigators examined the old case, the clearer it became that the DNA had been the thread that connected the past to the present. It was the one piece of evidence capable of crossing the entire timeline without changing. The biological material recovered after Angie's death had been preserved, analyzed, and eventually compared with modern DNA evidence. The result was devastatingly clear. The DNA associated with Dripps matched the profile recovered from Angie's body. Idaho State Police records identify that comparison as a critical part of the 2019 breakthrough. isp.idaho.gov, but the scientific breakthrough also raised a disturbing question. If the DNA belonged to Dripps, why had Christopher Tapp been convicted? The answer lay in the history of the original investigation, a history that would eventually become inseparable from the question of wrongful conviction. Tapp had been questioned extensively and ultimately convicted of Angie's murder, rape, and use of a deadly weapon. His conviction was affirmed on appeal, and for years the legal system treated him as the person responsible. Yet the biological evidence continued to point toward an unknown male. That contradiction was never truly resolved. The conviction existed. The DNA profile existed. The two did not fit together. As new testing and legal challenges developed, that conflict became increasingly significant. The case against Tapp was eventually dismantled, and on July 26, 2019, his conviction was vacated and dismissed on the basis of actual innocence. sco.idaho.gov. The date marked a historic reversal. After years of being known as the man convicted of Angie's murder, Tapp was officially cleared. But the victory was complicated because freedom could not restore the years he had spent imprisoned. The legal record could change. The calendar could not. Every day that had passed behind bars remained part of his life. Every family event he missed remained missed. Every relationship affected by the conviction remained affected. That is the cruel mathematics of wrongful imprisonment. Even when the truth finally arrives, it cannot travel backward. The truth can open a prison door, but it cannot return lost time. At the same time, the person responsible for Angie's murder had spent those same years outside prison. According to court documents, Dripps later admitted that he had acted alone. Transparency, resources.idaho.gov. That statement made the contrast even more painful. While Tapp's life was being defined by a crime he did not commit, the real offender remained free. The case had therefore produced an extraordinary inversion of justice. The wrong man had been imprisoned. The right man had remained unidentified, and the evidence that eventually corrected the error had been present from the beginning. The breakthrough came only after investigators and forensic specialists approached that evidence with tools that had not existed when Angie was killed. genetic genealogy became the bridge. It allowed investigators to move beyond the limitations of direct DNA databases and search for relatives of the unknown contributor. That process ultimately helped identify Drips as the person whose DNA matched the evidence. The method was revolutionary because it changed what investigators meant when they asked whether a suspect's DNA was in the system. The suspect did not need to be there. His relatives might be, and from those relatives, investigators could build a biological family tree. That tree could eventually point toward a particular individual, but investigators still needed direct evidence. In Angie's case, they obtained DNA associated with Drips from a cigarette butt, and that DNA matched the profile from the crime scene. isb.idaho.gov. The cigarette, but became one of the strangest objects in the entire investigation. It was not collected in 1996. It came decades later after investigators already had a genealogical lead, yet it allowed them to perform a direct forensic comparison and transform the lead into a confirmed identification. The science was now speaking with a level of certainty the original investigation had never possessed. The unknown male from 1996 and the man investigators were examining in 2019 were genetically the same. The distance between those two moments was more than 2 decades, but the DNA connected them instantly. Then Drips confessed. According to court documents, he admitted to the rape and murder of Angie and stated that he had acted alone. Transparencyresources.idaho.gov. His confession added another layer to the case, but investigators still had to consider the evidence carefully. A confession does not exist in isolation. It must be examined against the physical evidence, the known timeline, and the facts established by the investigation. In this case, the DNA evidence provided an independent connection between Drips and Angie. That made the confession far more significant because it was supported by forensic evidence collected long before Drips became a suspect. The case therefore demonstrated a principle at the heart of modern homicide investigations. The strongest conclusions often come when independent pieces of evidence converge. DNA identified the biological source. Genetic genealogy created the investigative path. A direct DNA comparison confirmed the suspect. The confession provided his account. The legal proceedings addressed the wrongful conviction. Each element reinforced the others, yet none of this changed the most important fact. Angie Dodge had been 21 years old when she was killed. She had a future that never happened. Her family had been left with questions that lasted for decades. For those who loved her, the case was never simply an investigative puzzle. It was a permanent absence. Every anniversary carried the same unanswered question. Every year without an arrest meant another year wondering whether the person responsible was nearby, whether he was living an ordinary life, whether he knew investigators were still searching, whether he believed the case would remain unsolved forever. That psychological burden is one of the least visible aspects of a cold case. The public sees headlines. Investigators see evidence. Families live with silence. The silence can become part of daily life. Then, suddenly, the phone rings. A detective has new information. A DNA test has produced a lead. A genealogist has found a connection. A suspect has been identified. The silence breaks. But what comes after is complicated. Families must absorb the truth they have waited decades to receive. Sometimes the truth is not what they imagined. Sometimes the person responsible is someone they never knew. Sometimes another innocent person's life has also been damaged. And sometimes the solution creates new questions instead of eliminating them. The Angie Dodge case contained all of those elements. The identity of the killer answered the central question, but it also exposed the failure that had allowed the wrong person to be convicted. It showed how fragile an investigation can become when a theory gains momentum before the physical evidence is fully understood. It also demonstrated the importance of preserving biological evidence for future testing. When Angie was killed, nobody could know what DNA technology would look like more than 20 years later. Nobody could know that genetic genealogy would become a powerful tool for investigators. Nobody could know that a discarded cigarette would eventually help confirm the identity of the man whose DNA had been recovered from the original crime scene. But someone preserved the evidence. That decision became crucial. Without the original biological material, there would have been no DNA profile to compare. Without the profile, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to search. Without the genealogical lead, investigators might never have reached Drip. And without the direct comparison, the investigation would have lacked the definitive forensic connection. The entire chain depended on evidence surviving. That is why cold case investigators often treat old evidence with a different kind of respect. A piece of evidence that produced nothing 30 years ago may produce everything today. Technology can change. Databases can expand. Scientific methods can improve. But once biological material has been destroyed, the opportunity is gone forever. Angie's case showed what can happen when that opportunity is preserved. The investigation also changed the public understanding of genetic genealogy. Before cases like this, many people associated genealogy with family history, ancestry research, and the search for distant relatives. Suddenly, those same biological relationships were helping investigators solve violent crimes. The family tree had become an investigative tool. It was no longer only about discovering where a family came from. It could potentially reveal where an unknown offender came from. That power brought enormous possibilities, but it also required careful legal and ethical oversight. Investigators had to distinguish between genetic leads and proof, between relatives and suspects, between probability and certainty. The Angie Dodge case demonstrated why those distinctions mattered. The genealogical process led investigators toward drips, but the direct DNA comparison provided the confirmation. That separation between lead and proof was essential. The investigation had to move from the abstract world of genetic relationships into the concrete world of forensic evidence. And once the match was established, the case changed forever. The man whose DNA had haunted investigators since 1996 finally had a name. The man convicted in his place finally had evidence supporting his innocence. And Angie Dodge finally had a path toward justice. But justice was still incomplete. A conviction could be overturned. A suspect could be identified. A confession could be obtained. Yet none of those things could return the years that had disappeared between Angie's death and the moment the truth emerged. The case had taken nearly 3 decades to reach this point, and that delay became part of its meaning. It showed that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the evidence is simply waiting for a future investigator to ask a better question. In Angie's case, that question was not simply, who killed her? It was, what can the DNA tell us now that it could not tell us then? The answer reached across generations. It crossed family trees. It passed through databases and laboratories. It eventually landed on one man. And when that man was identified, the story that had begun with an unknown killer suddenly became something far more complicated. The story of a victim finally named, an innocent man finally cleared, and a hidden offender finally exposed by evidence that had been waiting in silence for 23 years. For years, the Angie Dodge investigation existed in 2 separate worlds. In one world, there was the official conviction of Christopher Tapp, a man the justice system had declared responsible for Angie's death. In the other, there was the biological evidence pointing towards an unknown male. The 2 worlds could not remain separate forever. Eventually, modern DNA testing forced them to collide, and when they did, the consequences were devastating. The evidence did not merely identify Brian Drip, it exposed the weakness at the center of the original case and created the foundation for Tapp's exoneration. But before that final reckoning, investigators had to understand exactly what the new DNA evidence meant and why it carried such extraordinary weight. The key was the distinction between association and identification. A person might have known Angie. A person might have been in her apartment. A person might have had contact with her at some point, but the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation provided a much more specific connection. It came from the crime itself. The unknown male profile was not simply a name appearing in a witness statement. It was a genetic signature recovered from evidence connected to the murder. For years, investigators had searched for a direct match and failed. Then, genetic genealogy changed the search. Instead of looking for the unknown man inside a criminal database, investigators could look for biological relatives in genealogy databases and reconstruct the family network surrounding him. That strategy was revolutionary because it transformed the problem. The killer did not need to have a criminal record. He did not need to have been arrested before. He did not need to have voluntarily given DNA to law enforcement. He only needed to have relatives whose genetic information could help investigators identify the family line from which he came. Once investigators had a possible family connection, they could move back toward traditional police work. They could identify candidates, examine their histories, establish where they lived, and determine whether their movements were consistent with the crime. The final step was direct DNA comparison. In the Angie Dodge investigation, that comparison linked Brian Dripps to the crime scene profile. Idaho State Police documented that a DNA sample associated with Dripps matched the DNA recovered from Angie's body. isp.idaho.gov. Suddenly, the unknown male who had existed for more than 2 decades as a genetic profile had a human identity. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. For 23 years, investigators had been unable to place a name beside the biological evidence. Now they could. The investigation had moved from an anonymous genetic profile to Brian Dripps, but the story was not finished because identifying the biological source of evidence did not erase the conviction of Christopher Tapp. That required a separate legal process, and that process would force authorities to acknowledge the full extent of what had gone wrong. Tapp had been convicted in 1998 and had spent years in prison while maintaining that he was not responsible for Angie's murder. His conviction had become part of the official history of the case. Yet as DNA testing advanced, the biological evidence became increasingly difficult to reconcile with his conviction. The DNA did not match Tapp. It matched another man. That fact became central to the effort to overturn his conviction. The legal system eventually recognized the new evidence, and in July 2019, Tapp's conviction was vacated and dismissed based on actual innocence. sco.idaho.gov. For Tapp, the ruling represented freedom, but freedom after wrongful imprisonment is complicated. The word exonerated can sound final, as though everything immediately becomes normal again. It does not. The years remain. The memories remain. The consequences remain. A person who loses years to prison does not receive those years back when a judge declares him innocent. Families do not recover the time they lost. Careers and relationships can be permanently altered. The emotional damage cannot be measured in a court document, yet the legal recognition of innocence still matters enormously because it restores something that had been taken away. The truth. Tapp was no longer officially identified as Angie's killer. The conviction was gone. The record acknowledged that the evidence had led investigators to the wrong person, and the real offender had been identified through forensic evidence that could not be dismissed as a vague theory. The case had therefore become a warning about the danger of relying too heavily on investigative narrative. Once investigators become convinced that a particular person is responsible, every new piece of information can be interpreted through that assumption. Evidence that supports the theory may receive greater attention, while evidence that contradicts it may be explained away or minimized. That phenomenon can be especially dangerous in high-pressure homicide investigations. Detectives want answers. Families demand answers. Prosecutors need a case. The public expects an arrest, but science does not respond to pressure. DNA does not change because investigators want a particular suspect to be guilty. It simply reports what the biological evidence can support. In Angie's case, the DNA eventually forced the investigation to confront a reality that had been present for years. The man convicted was not the man whose DNA was recovered from the crime scene. That realization opened the door to a new investigation, one centered on the actual biological evidence rather than the old theory. And as investigators reconstructed the case, the role of genetic genealogy became increasingly important. Idaho State Police has described investigative genetic genealogy as a method used to generate investigative leads in cold cases by combining forensic DNA analysis with genealogical research. isp.idaho.gov. The process can involve searching publicly accessible genetic genealogy databases, identifying relatives of an unknown DNA contributor, constructing family trees, and narrowing the possibilities until investigators can identify a person for direct testing. But it is not a shortcut. It is a long investigative process that can involve hundreds or thousands of potential relatives and an enormous amount of historical research. The investigators must distinguish biological relationships from coincidence. They must confirm family connections through records. They must eliminate candidates who do not fit the evidence. And once a potential suspect emerges, law enforcement must obtain a direct sample and compare it to the crime scene. DNA, the Angie Dodge case, demonstrated the full power of that approach because the genealogical ultimately led to a direct DNA match. It was not simply a family resemblance, it was a forensic connection. And then came the confession. According to official records, Dripps admitted to the rape and murder and stated that he acted alone. Transparencyresources.idaho.gov. That confession provided another piece of the puzzle, but the DNA remained critical because it was independent of the confession. The evidence had existed before Dripps ever became a suspect. It had been collected from the crime scene decades earlier. It was not created because investigators confronted him. It was not dependent on his memory. It was physical evidence connecting the unknown offender to Angie. That independence gave the case extraordinary strength. The killer's own words could be examined against the DNA. The DNA could be examined against the crime scene, and the genealogical investigation could be examined against the direct match. The pieces aligned, yet the human consequences remained painful. Angie's family had waited decades for the truth. They had lived through years when the person responsible was unknown, then years when another man was believed to be responsible, and finally the shocking realization that the original conviction had been wrong. Imagine the emotional whiplash of that sequence. First, there is the loss of a daughter, sister, or loved one. Then comes the belief that the killer has been found. Then doubt. Then renewed uncertainty. Then a new name. Then the discovery that the convicted man was innocent. Then, finally, the identification of the real offender. Justice did not arrive as one clean moment. It came in stages, each one carrying its own pain. The case also revealed how the passage of time can work in contradictory ways. Time can destroy evidence. Time can erase memories. Time can separate witnesses from investigators, but time can also produce technological breakthroughs. It can allow scientists to develop new methods. It can create larger genetic databases. It can provide investigators with tools that did not exist when the crime occurred. In Angie's case, time ultimately became part of the solution. The killer benefited from the limitations of 1996, but those limitations did not last forever. Science moved forward. Genetic genealogy emerged. DNA testing became more sophisticated. Investigators learned how to search for biological relatives rather than requiring a direct criminal database match. The evidence that had been silent for years finally became useful in a new way, and that is why the case remains such a powerful example of persistence. A cold case can look dead from the outside while remaining very much alive inside the evidence room. The boxes may sit untouched for years. The detectives who collected the evidence may retire. The original witnesses may age, but biological material can remain. A fingerprint can remain. A photograph can remain. A document can remain. And if technology improves, those objects can suddenly become active again. The Angie Dodge case showed exactly that transformation. The biological evidence went from being a clue without an identity to becoming a path toward the offender. The case also influenced the broader conversation about using forensic genetic genealogy in investigation. Idaho State Police has expanded its cold case efforts and has emphasized advanced DNA testing as part of efforts to revisit unsolved cases. isp.idaho.gov. The lesson was clear. Old evidence should not be dismissed simply because earlier testing failed. A negative result in one era does not necessarily mean the evidence has no future value. It may simply mean the technology has not caught up. For Angie Dodge, that future eventually arrived. The evidence had waited 23 years, and then modern science turned it into an identity. But the emotional center of the case remained Angie herself. She was more than the DNA profile, more than the courtroom exhibit, more than the headline about genetic genealogy. She was a 21-year-old woman whose life was taken from her. The investigation could analyze every strand of evidence, reconstruct every timeline, and identify every person involved, but none of that could restore her future. The purpose of solving the case was not merely to satisfy curiosity, it was to establish accountability and give her family the truth. And after decades, the truth finally had a name. Brian Drips. The name carried the weight of the evidence, the confession, and the legal proceedings that followed, but it also carried the weight of everything that had happened before the breakthrough. A young woman murdered, an unknown offender free, an innocent man imprisoned, a family waiting, and a DNA profile sitting silently in evidence storage while the world changed around it. The case had crossed from 1996 into 2019, and the bridge between those years was smaller than anyone could have imagined. A microscopic biological trait, a genealogical connection, a discarded cigarette, a laboratory comparison. That was enough to reopen a story that had been buried beneath decades of uncertainty. And once it reopened, the past could no longer remain buried. The case had finally reached the point where the name Brian Drips could no longer be separated from the evidence that had haunted investigators since 1996. But identifying the man was only one part of the reckoning, because the investigation had now become a story about two men standing on opposite sides of the same DNA profile, one, the actual offender, and the other, a man who had spent years being blamed for a crime he did not commit. The biological evidence had connected Drips to Angie Dodge, while at the same time helping establish that Christopher Tapp was not the source of that evidence, and this created an extraordinary legal and emotional reversal. For years, the public had heard one version of the case. Now the scientific evidence demanded another. The old narrative had to be dismantled piece by piece. Investigators had to return to the evidence and ask not what they had once believed, but what the evidence actually demonstrated. That change in perspective is one of the most difficult things in any cold case investigation. People naturally want a case to have a beginning, middle, and end. A murder occurs. Detectives investigate. A suspect is identified. A conviction follows. The story closes. But real investigations rarely move in such a straight line. Sometimes the apparent ending is wrong. Sometimes a conviction is not the conclusion, but another chapter in the mystery. Sometimes the most important evidence becomes more important decades later. The Angie Dodge case followed exactly that path. The original conviction had seemed to close the investigation, but the DNA kept the case alive. The unknown male profile remained a silent contradiction, and eventually that contradiction became impossible to ignore. The breakthrough began with the recognition that traditional DNA searching was not enough. The unknown offender was not appearing as a direct match in the law enforcement databases available to investigators, but forensic genetic genealogy offered another route. Researchers could look for biological relatives and use those relationships to reconstruct a family tree. The technique was fundamentally different from ordinary database searching. Instead of asking whether the suspect himself was already known to law enforcement, investigators asked whether someone related to him had voluntarily contributed genetic information to a genealogy database. That seemingly small change created an entirely new investigative universe. A distant cousin could become a clue. A great-grandparent could become the starting point. A family line could become a map leading toward the unknown offender. But the process required careful verification. A genetic match could indicate a relationship without identifying the exact person. Genealogists had to build family trees, examine records, eliminate unrelated branches, and determine which living individuals fit the genetic and geographic information. Only after the family tree narrowed could investigators move toward direct suspect testing. In the Angie Dodge case, that work ultimately led investigators toward Brian Drips. The next step was decisive. Investigators obtained DNA associated with Drips from a cigarette butt and compared it with the biological evidence from Angie's murder. The samples matched. isp.idaho.gov. Suddenly, the man who had existed only as a distant possibility became the source of the DNA recovered from the crime scene. The match did something that decades of traditional investigation had failed to do. It connected the biological evidence to a specific person. But the case did not rely on DNA alone. According to court documents, Dripps confessed to the rape and murder of Angie and stated that he acted alone. He also denied knowing Christopher Tapp. TransparencyResources.idaho.gov. That confession transformed the legal landscape. It provided investigators with a direct statement from the person whose DNA matched the crime scene evidence, while also directly contradicting the original theory that Tapp was responsible. The consequences for Tapp were immediate and profound. His legal team had spent years challenging the conviction, and the new evidence gave those challenges an entirely different foundation. This was no longer simply an argument that the original investigation might have made mistake. There was now a confirmed DNA match to another man and a confession from that man. In July 2019, Tapp's conviction was vacated and dismissed based on actual innocence. sco.idaho.gov. The legal language was powerful, but the human reality behind it was even more powerful. Tapp had spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit. His innocence had existed as a contested claim for years, but now scientific evidence provided a foundation strong enough to change the official record. The man once identified as Angie's killer was no longer legally responsible for her death. The real offender had been found. Yet the correction came decades after the original crime. That delay became one of the most painful aspects of the entire case. Justice had eventually moved forward, but it had moved forward slowly. For Angie Dodge's family, the identification of Dripps finally answered the question that had haunted them for years, but it also forced them to confront the fact that the person responsible had been free for more than 2 decades. Every year without an answer represented another year in which the family could not fully understand what had happened. Every year in which Tapp remained imprisoned represented another year in which the justice system had not corrected its mistake. The breakthrough, therefore, carried both relief and anger. Relief because the killer was finally identified. Anger because it had taken so long. And underneath both emotions was grief because none of the evidence could change what happened to Angie. She remained the young woman whose life ended in 1996. The DNA could tell investigators who had been responsible. It could not tell the world who Angie might have become if she had lived. That is something no cold case investigation can recover. The victim's future is the one piece of evidence that can never be reconstructed. Investigators can recover DNA. They can recover fingerprints. They can recover old photographs. They can recover records and testimony. They can even reconstruct portions of a victim's final journey, but they cannot recover the years the victim was supposed to live. And that is why solving a cold case is both powerful and painfully incomplete. The case can be solved. The victim cannot be brought back. The investigators continued examining the circumstances surrounding Angie's death, but the forensic identification remained the central turning point. The biological evidence collected decades earlier had survived long enough for science to catch up. That fact also transformed how investigators viewed old evidence in other cases. Idaho State Police has emphasized the importance of advanced forensic testing and genetic genealogy in the investigation of cold cases, recognizing that evidence that could not produce an answer decades ago may become valuable as technology advances. ISP.idaho.gov. The Angie Dodge case became a demonstration of that principle. The evidence had not become stronger because of time. It had become more useful because science had become more capable. That distinction matters. Investigators cannot assume that a case is impossible simply because older testing failed. A biological sample may contain information that current methods cannot retrieve, but future methods can. A fingerprint that produced no match today might produce one tomorrow. A genealogy database that contains no useful relative now might contain 1 year later. Technology creates new possibilities, and cold cases can remain open precisely because investigators understand that future science may reveal what current science cannot. In Angie's case, the future arrived in 2019. It arrived through genetic genealogy, direct DNA testing, and the persistence of investigators who refused to treat the original evidence as useless. But there was another reason the case became so significant. It demonstrated that forensic science could serve as a corrective force. DNA did not merely help identify Dripps, it helped challenge and establish conviction. It forced the justice system to reconsider evidence that had once been treated as sufficient. That is one of the most important functions of forensic evidence. It should not simply confirm what investigators already believe. It should have the power to contradict them. If the evidence says the suspect is innocent, the investigation must be willing to accept that. If the evidence points toward another person, investigators must follow it, even if doing so means reopening a case they believed was already solved. The Angie Dodge investigation eventually did exactly that. The evidence demanded a new story, and the new story was far more complicated than the original one. The original case had produced a conviction. The new evidence produced an exoneration and a new suspect. The original investigation had focused on a man who did not contribute the crime scene DNA. The renewed investigation focused on the person whose DNA did. The original conclusion had seemed final. The scientific evidence proved it was not. This transformation also underscored the danger of false certainty. A case can appear solved while the most important question remains unanswered. The existence of a conviction does not necessarily mean the investigation has reached the truth. The truth must survive testing. It must survive new evidence. It must survive the possibility that the original assumptions were wrong. In Angie's case, the truth survived all of those things. The DNA remained consistent. The genetic relationship remained traceable. The direct comparison remained conclusive, and the confession provided another piece of corroboration. Eventually, the legal system recognized what the evidence had demonstrated. Christopher Tapp was innocent. Brian Dripps was responsible. Angie Dodge had finally been given the justice that had eluded her for decades. Yet even after the legal reversal, the case left behind an unsettling question about the years between 1996 and 2019. What was happening while the killer remained free? How did he live with the knowledge of what he had done? Did he believe investigators would eventually find him? Did he believe the case had been forgotten? Did he follow the investigation from a distance? Those questions are haunting, but they must be separated from what can actually be established by evidence. A cold case narrative can easily become speculation, especially when a suspect has remained unidentified for years. Investigators must resist that temptation. What is known is far more powerful. The DNA recovered from Angie's case eventually matched Dripps. A direct sample associated with him produced the match. He confessed according to court documents. Tapp's conviction was overturned based on the new evidence. Those are the facts that transformed the case. Everything else remains part of the unanswered human story, and perhaps that is what makes the case so unsettling. The killer did not need to fear a dramatic breakthrough for most of his life. He only needed the technology of the time to remain limited. But technology does not stand still. The same DNA that once led nowhere eventually became a road leading directly to him. The family tree became the map. The cigarette became the confirmation. The laboratory became the final witness. And the old crime scene finally produced the answer that investigators had been searching for since 1996. The case had survived 23 years of silence, but silence had never meant that the evidence was gone. It only meant that nobody had yet found the language needed to interpret it. When they finally did, the story changed forever. The breakthrough in the Angie Dodge case did not arrive with a dramatic confession in a crowded courtroom or a witness suddenly remembering a forgotten face. It began with something almost invisible, something that could fit on the head of a pin and yet had survived more than 2 decades of silence. DNA had been recovered from the original investigation, preserved while technology changed around it, and eventually transformed from an unidentified profile into a path toward the man responsible for Angie's death. But the discovery of Brian Dripps created another unavoidable question. What had happened to the investigation before science finally exposed the truth? To answer that, investigators and attorneys had to look carefully at the years when Christopher Tapp was imprisoned, the years when the official explanation of the murder seemed settled, and the years when the biological evidence continued to contradict that explanation. The story of Angie Dodge had become more than a cold case. It had become a warning about what can happen when a criminal investigation reaches a conclusion before every piece of evidence has been fully understood. Tapp's conviction had once represented finality. The jury had reached a verdict. The courts had reviewed the case. His conviction had been upheld. Yet behind that apparent finality, the DNA profile remained unresolved. It belonged to an unknown male. That fact did not disappear simply because a different man had been convicted. The evidence continued to exist, waiting for a future investigator to ask whether the original conclusion could actually withstand modern forensic analysis. That question became increasingly important as DNA technology developed. The forensic world of the late 1990s was not the forensic world of 2019. Genetic databases expanded. Laboratory techniques improved. Investigators became more familiar with the power of biological evidence. And perhaps most importantly, forensic genetic genealogy emerged as a new method for identifying unknown individuals. The principle was deceptively simple. If investigators could not find the offender directly, perhaps they could find his relative. A distant relative could reveal a family branch. That branch could reveal another generation. Another record could reveal another connection. Gradually, an invisible biological network could become a visible family tree. Somewhere inside that tree might be the person whose DNA had been recovered from Angie's case. It was an entirely different way of thinking about an unidentified suspect. Traditional investigation asks, who is this person? Genetic genealogy could begin with a different question. Who is this person's family? That change opened a door that had been closed for years. The genealogical work eventually pointed investigators toward Brian Drips, but a genealogy lead could never be the final word. Investigators needed direct evidence. That evidence came when DNA associated with Drips was compared with the crime scene profile the match, provided the confirmation necessary to transform an investigative lead into a forensic identification. Idaho State Police documented the significance of the DNA comparison in its forensic reporting, identifying the match between Drips and the biological evidence connected to Angie Dodge's murder. The science had finally accomplished what years of conventional searching had failed to accomplish. It had given the unknown man a name, but the name itself was only the beginning of the reckoning. Once Drips had been identified, investigators could examine his connection to the case through the lens of evidence that had not been available during the original investigation. According to court documents, Drips ultimately confessed to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge and said that he had acted alone. He also stated that he did not know Christopher Tapp. Those statements carried enormous consequences. They were not the only evidence against Drips. The DNA already connected him to the crime scene, but the confession provided investigators with information directly from the man they had identified through the forensic evidence. More importantly, it helped explain why the DNA had pointed away from Tapp all along. The original conviction could no longer be viewed as simply an unresolved legal dispute. There was now a different suspect, a DNA match, and a confession. The old case had to be rewritten. For Tapp, the consequences were extraordinary. He had spent years carrying the identity of a murderer that the evidence now showed was false. His conviction had been part of the official record, but the new forensic evidence shattered that conclusion. In 2019, his conviction was vacated and dismissed on the basis of actual innocence. That legal phrase was not merely symbolic. It represented the recognition that the person who had been convicted was not responsible for the murder. Yet the legal correction could not erase the years already lost. That is one of the cruelest realities of wrongful conviction. The justice system can reverse a judgment, but it cannot reverse time. A person can walk out of prison, but the years behind the walls remain part of his history. The missed birthdays remain missed. The relationships that changed remain changed. The opportunities that disappeared cannot simply be restored. For Tapp, the DNA breakthrough therefore carried two opposite meanings at once. It was proof of freedom, but it was also proof of how much had gone wrong. For Angie's family, the discovery carried its own complicated emotions. The person responsible had finally been identified. The uncertainty that had lasted for decades had an answer, but that answer came after years of waiting and after another man's life had been devastated by a wrongful conviction. The case was no longer a simple story of a killer finally caught. It was a story about the consequences of an investigation that had taken a wrong turn and about the remarkable ability of forensic science to correct that mistake decades later. The passage of time had become almost a character in the case. 23 years separated Angie's murder from the identification of Drip. During those years, the world changed. Technology changed. Investigative methods changed. People who had been young when Angie died grew older. Detectives who had worked the original case moved on, but the evidence remained. That is what makes preserved biological evidence so powerful in cold cases. Human memory deteriorates. Witnesses forget details. People relocate. Records disappear. But DNA can remain stable enough to be tested long after the crime. And when new technology becomes available, evidence that once produced no answer can suddenly become decisive. Idaho State Police has emphasized the role of advanced forensic methods and genetic genealogy in revisiting cold cases, recognizing that modern DNA science can provide new investigative opportunities in cases that remained unresolved for decades. The Angie Dodge case became one of the clearest demonstrations of that principle. The case also changed the way people think about the word unsolved. An unsolved murder is not necessarily a murder without evidence. Sometimes it is a murder with evidence that investigators cannot yet interpret. That difference is enormous. In 1996, investigators had biological material. They had a crime scene. They had witnesses and investigative leads. What they did not have was the technology capable of connecting the unknown DNA to a specific person. 23 years later, they did. The breakthrough, therefore, did not come from discovering evidence that had never existed. It came from rediscovering the value of evidence that had been there all along. And this is where the story becomes particularly striking. The killer's greatest protection may not have been his ability to destroy evidence. It may simply have been the limitations of the era. As long as the unknown DNA remained unmatched, the identity remained hidden. But technology does not remain frozen. A criminal database can expand. A genealogy database can grow. A laboratory can develop new methods. A detective can learn a new technique. A cold case can suddenly become active again because the world has changed. The offender does not have to make a mistake in the present. The investigators only need to gain a better tool for examining the past. That was what happened here. The old DNA profile became the center of a modern investigation. The family tree became a roadmap. The direct DNA sample became confirmation, and the confession added another layer to the evidence. The case had finally moved from uncertainty toward accountability. But there was another disturbing lesson hidden inside the breakthrough. The investigation showed how dangerous it can be when a confession or investigative theory becomes more powerful than objective forensic evidence. Modern DNA evidence ultimately provided an independent way to test the original conclusion. It did not care about the narrative investigators had developed. It did not care about the pressure surrounding the case. It did not care that a conviction already existed. It simply showed whose biological material was present. That is why DNA became so important in clearing TAP. It was not merely another argument. It was evidence capable of directly challenging the old conclusion. The lesson was painful but clear. A conviction is not the same thing as truth. Truth must survive scrutiny. It must survive new evidence. It must survive scientific testing. And when new evidence demonstrates that the original conclusion was wrong, the system must be willing to admit the mistake. In Angie's case, that admission eventually came. The conviction was overturned. The real offender was identified. The forensic evidence had prevailed over the assumptions of the past. Yet the case still carried an eerie question that could never be answered completely. Why did the truth take so long to emerge? Part of the answer was technology. Part was the complexity of the investigation. Part was the limitations of the original evidence analysis. And part was simply the unpredictable nature of cold cases. Sometimes the breakthrough comes because one investigator refuses to stop looking. Sometimes it comes because a new laboratory technique becomes available. Sometimes it comes because a distant relative uploads DNA to a genealogy database without ever realizing that the information may eventually help identify a murderer. A decision made for personal curiosity can unexpectedly become part of a homicide investigation decades later. In Angie's case, the chain of events ultimately reached backward across generations. The victim had been 21 when she died. The person responsible had lived for decades after the crime. An innocent man had lost years of his life, and the DNA evidence had waded through all of it. When the breakthrough finally arrived, It was not loud. DNA does not announce itself. It does not create a dramatic sound. It does not point a finger. It simply produces a comparison, a profile, a match, a result. But sometimes a result can shake an entire case. The match 2 drips did exactly that. It transformed an unidentified offender into a named suspect, transformed an old conviction into a wrongful conviction, and transformed a decades-old mystery into a case that could finally move toward justice. And as investigators continued examining what the new evidence meant, the story of Christopher Tapp became impossible to separate from the story of Angie Dodge. One life had been taken. Another had been wrongly imprisoned. The real killer had remained outside prison. 3 lives, 3 radically different paths, all connected by the same crime and ultimately by the same DNA evidence. The most powerful witness in the case had been silent for 23 years. It had no memory to lose, no story to change, no fear of investigators, and no reason to protect anyone. It was simply there, waiting. And when science finally learned how to listen, the silence ended. By the time the truth about Brian Drips began to emerge, the Angie Dodge case had become something far larger than a homicide investigation. It was now a story about evidence, memory, wrongful conviction, and the strange way technology can reach backward through time and expose a secret that seemed buried forever. The most important evidence had never disappeared. It had simply waited. The DNA recovered during the original investigation remained an unknown male profile for years, and that unknown profile became the silent contradiction running beneath the entire case. Christopher Tapp had been convicted, but the biological evidence did not belong to him. The distinction was devastating. It meant that the central question had never truly been answered. Who was the man whose DNA was present? For decades, that question had remained unanswered, and the absence of an answer allowed the original narrative to survive. But once investigators applied forensic genetic genealogy, the boundaries of the investigation changed. The unknown profile could be connected to relatives, relatives could lead to a family, and a family could eventually lead investigators toward a specific person. That person was Brian Drips. Yet even after investigators had developed that lead, they needed to prove it through conventional forensic testing. A genealogical connection was not enough. The investigation had to move from possibility to certainty. That happened when investigators obtained DNA associated with Drips and compared it with the biological evidence from Angie's case. The result was a match. The man whose identity had remained hidden for more than 2 decades was no longer unknown. The scientific trail had finally reached him. But the breakthrough also reopened a painful chapter for Christopher Tapp, because every piece of new evidence pointing toward Drips simultaneously weakened the case that had once sent Tapp to prison. The original conviction could no longer stand untouched. There was now a fundamental contradiction between the biological evidence and the legal conclusion. The DNA belonged to Drips. Tapp was not the source of that DNA, and according to court records, Drips later confessed to the rape and murder of Angie and said he had acted alone. The confession was not the beginning of the case against him, however. The forensic evidence came first. That distinction mattered. Investigators had not simply found a man and persuaded him to confess. They had followed genetic evidence to him and then obtained a direct DNA comparison that connected him to the biological evidence from the crime. The confession added another piece to an already powerful evidentiary picture. For Tapp, the consequences were enormous. The legal system eventually vacated and dismissed his conviction on the basis of actual innocence. The man who had spent years carrying the burden of a murder conviction was officially cleared. The reversal represented an extraordinary moment in the history of the investigation because the same case that had once defined Tapp as a convicted murderer now became evidence of his wrongful imprisonment. His story demonstrated how the passage of time can transform the meaning of evidence. In the beginning, DNA was simply one part of a difficult investigation. Later, it became the instrument that exposed the real offender. and then it became the evidence that helped clear the wrongfully convicted man. One piece of biological material had produced consequences in opposite direction. It pointed toward the person responsible and away from the person who had been wrongly accused. That is the power of objective forensic evidence when it is properly preserved and properly interpreted. It does not have to fit the story investigators expect. It can destroy that story. The Angie Dodge investigation became a painful reminder of that fact. Investigators can make assumptions, witnesses can make mistakes, memories can change, interrogations can produce unreliable statements, but DNA offers a different kind of evidence. It can remain connected to a crime long after human recollections have faded. In Angie's case, the biological evidence survived the years when the investigation seemed trapped. It survived changes in personnel. It survived changes in technology. It survived the passage of time, and eventually it became the strongest path toward the truth. Forensic genetic genealogy was especially important because it offered something traditional database searches could not. The unknown DNA did not have to belong to someone already known to law enforcement. The person could remain absent from criminal databases while still being connected biologically to people who had voluntarily contributed information to genealogy databases. That possibility changed cold case investigations around the country. Suddenly, an unidentified offender could be approached through his relative. The investigation could move backward through generations to move forward toward the suspect. The concept sounds almost impossible until the evidence actually produces a result. In Angie's case, it did. The genetic trail eventually narrowed toward drips, and direct DNA testing confirmed the connection. What had once been an anonymous biological profile now had a name. The significance of that transformation cannot be measured simply by saying that the case was solved. Solving the case changed the lives of everyone connected to it. For Angie's family, it finally provided an answer to a question that had remained open for decades. For investigators, it demonstrated that the evidence collected in an old case could still produce a breakthrough. For the legal system, it exposed a wrongful conviction that had lasted for years. And for Tapp, it represented the possibility of rebuilding a life after imprisonment for a crime he did not commit. But even the word solved carries limitations. Solving a murder does not restore the victim's life. It does not erase the years of grief. It does not restore the years lost by an innocent prisoner. It does not erase the fear and uncertainty experienced by a family waiting for answers. It simply establishes what happened and who was responsible. In a cold case, that truth can be immensely important, but it is never complete. Angie Dodge was still 21 when her life ended. Everything she might have experienced afterward disappeared with her. Careers she might have pursued, relationships she might have formed, places she might have visited, ordinary days she might have lived. None of those possibilities can be recovered through DNA. That is why the human story must remain at the center of the investigation. The technology may have solved the mystery, but the mystery existed because a young woman was killed. The evidence mattered because a person had been lost, and the legal battle mattered because another person's life had been damaged by the wrong conclusion. The case also raised a profound question about how many other old investigations might contain similar hidden answers. If DNA collected decades ago can suddenly become useful because of advances in genetic genealogy, how many unidentified profiles are still sitting in evidence rooms around the country? How many families are still waiting? How many cases that appear impossible might simply be waiting for the right technology? Idaho State Police has recognized the value of modern forensic methods in cold case investigations, including advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy. The Angie Dodge case demonstrated why such tools matter. An investigation does not always fail because there is no evidence. Sometimes it fails because the available technology cannot yet interpret the evidence. That distinction gives cold case investigators a reason to preserve evidence and continue searching. A profile that produces no result today may become the key tomorrow. A sample that seems limited may become valuable when laboratory techniques improve. A distant genetic relative may enter a database years after a crime and unintentionally create the connection investigators have been waiting for. Time can therefore work against an investigation, but it can also work for it. In Angie's case, time eventually produced the technology that changed everything, but technology alone did not solve the case. People had to decide to use it. Investigators had to reopen the questions. Forensic specialists had to analyze the evidence. Genealogists had to construct the connection. Detectives had to verify the lead. Laboratory scientists had to perform the direct comparison. Prosecutors and defense attorneys had to confront the implications, and the courts had to recognize what the new evidence meant for Tapp. Every step mattered. Remove one, and the path toward justice becomes weaker. That is why the story cannot be reduced to a headline about DNA. The DNA was the thread, but investigators had to follow it. The case had been dormant for years, yet the evidence was never truly asleep. It was waiting for a new method of interpretation. When that method arrived, the old mystery began to unravel, and as the investigators moved closer to the truth, the contrast between the past and present became almost impossible to ignore. In 1996, the offender was an unknown man. In 2019, investigators had his identity in the years between those dates. Christopher Tapp lived under the weight of a conviction that the new evidence would eventually prove wrong. The timeline itself became part of the tragedy. Every year that passed meant another year without justice for Angie and another year of wrongful imprisonment for Tapp. Meanwhile, the person whose DNA had been recovered remained unidentified. The case therefore contained not one injustice, but several. The murder itself was the first. The wrongful conviction became another. The delay in identifying the real offender became another. Yet the final breakthrough demonstrated that even after decades, evidence can still speak. The killer's identity had been hidden behind time, but time could not erase the biological evidence. It could not make the DNA belong to someone else. It could not change the direct comparison. It could not remove the significance of the confession. Eventually, the truth became stronger than the old narrative. And that is perhaps the most haunting lesson of the entire investigation. A criminal may disappear into ordinary life. He may become older. He may move. He may build relationships. He may convince himself that the past is bare. But evidence can wait. The DNA left behind does not age the way a memory does. It does not forget the person connected to it. It remains a silent record of the past. In Angie's case, that silent record survived long enough for modern science to unlock it. The killer was no longer an unidentified profile. He had a name. Christopher Tapp was no longer legally identified as the murderer. His conviction was gone, and Angie's family finally had an answer that had taken more than 2 decades to arrive. Yet there was still one final reality that no court, no scientist, and no detective could change. The answer had come too late to save Angie. The breakthrough could expose the truth, but it could not rewrite the night when her life ended. And that is where the power of the case ultimately lies. It is not simply a story about a killer discovered through DNA. It is a story about how truth can survive even when justice takes years to find it, how a tiny biological trace can outlast a false accusation, and how the past can return without warning when science finally learns how to read what was left behind. The case had spent decades in darkness. Then, one genetic clue opened the door, and once that door opened, everything investigators thought they knew about the murder had to be reconsidered. The identification of Brian Drips changed the direction of the Angie Dodge investigation, but it did not erase the years that came before it. For Christopher Tapp, the new DNA evidence meant something painfully simple. The biological evidence that investigators had been trying to understand for decades had never belonged to him. For Angie's family, it meant the person responsible had finally been identified. For investigators, it meant that a case once believed to have reached its conclusion had to be understood all over again. And for the wider world, it became a powerful demonstration of what modern forensic science could do when old evidence was preserved long enough for new technology to catch up with it. The case had begun in Idaho Falls in 1996, but its most important breakthrough occurred more than 2 decades later. That enormous gap in time became part of the story itself. 23 years separated the murder from the identification of the man whose DNA had been recovered from the crime scene. During those years, the evidence waited while the people connected to it grew older, moved forward, and in some cases disappeared from the investigation entirely. But DNA remained. It did not become confused. It did not forget. It did not develop a new version of events. The genetic profile recovered from the original evidence remained a fixed point around which the entire case could eventually be rebuilt. That is why the later breakthrough was so powerful. Investigators were not beginning with a new crime scene. They were returning to evidence that had existed since the beginning. Modern science simply gave them a new way to interpret it. The critical development was forensic genetic genealogy. Traditional DNA databases are designed primarily to identify direct matches between crime scene DNA and known profiles. But what happens when the person responsible has never been arrested and his DNA is not in the system? That was the problem investigators faced in the Angie Dodge case. The unknown male profile could not produce a direct identification through the conventional search. Genetic genealogy offered another possibility. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators could search for relatives. A relative might share enough genetic material with the unknown contributor to reveal a family connection. That connection could lead to a family tree. The family tree could lead to possible individuals, and those individuals could then be investigated through traditional methods. The technique transformed the unknown DNA from a dead end into a starting point. The investigative process eventually led to Brian Dripps, but the genealogical connection alone was never treated as the final proof. Investigators obtained DNA associated with Dripps and compared it with the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. The result was a match. Idaho State Police documented the DNA connection as a key part of the investigation that finally identified the unknown offender. The match was the moment when decades of uncertainty began to collapse. The biological evidence had a name, but the story became even more significant because of what happened afterward. Dripps confessed to the rape and murder of Angie Dodge, according to court documents, and said he acted alone. The confession was important, but it did not exist in isolation. It was supported by the DNA evidence. The forensic evidence had led investigators to him before the confession, and the direct DNA comparison had established the biological connection. That convergence gave the case a strength the original investigation had lacked. At the same time, the evidence created an undeniable problem for the conviction of Christopher Tapp. If Dripps was the source of the crime scene DNA and had confessed to killing Angie, then the conviction of Tapp required immediate reconsideration. The legal system eventually responded. In July 2019, Tapp's conviction was vacated and dismissed based on actual innocence. The ruling marked one of the most extraordinary turns in the entire investigation. For years, Tapp had been associated with Angie's murder. Now the court formally recognized that he had not committed it. His innocence was no longer simply a claim made by a defendant. It had become part of the official legal record. But the emotional consequences could not be resolved with a court order. The years Tapp spent incarcerated could not be returned. The time could not be reconstructed. His life had continued inside prison while the real offender remained unidentified outside. That reality added another dimension to Angie's story. The case was not only about finding a murderer, it was about understanding how an investigation could produce such a devastating mistake. The new evidence forced authorities to look back. What had investigators believed? What evidence had influenced the original prosecution? How had the case against Tapp developed? And why had the unknown DNA not produced the identity of Dripps sooner? Those questions mattered because solving a cold case is not simply about identifying the person responsible. It is also about learning from what happened before the breakthrough. Every wrongful conviction contains lessons. Every exoneration reveals weaknesses that investigators and courts must understand. And every case solved through new technology demonstrates how forensic science can change the balance between uncertainty and proof. The Angie Dodge case contained all three. The original investigation had reached a conclusion that later proved wrong. The conviction was eventually overturned, and modern DNA technology provided the path toward the real offender. The case, therefore, became a powerful argument for continuing to test and preserve evidence from old investigations. A forensic sample that seems incapable of producing an answer today may become decisive years later. Idaho State Police has continued to emphasize cold case work and advance forensic methods, including DNA analysis and genetic genealogy, as tools for revisiting old investigations. The lesson is particularly important in homicide cases because the victim's family may wait decades for an answer. Every year that passes can make the investigation harder, but the existence of preserved evidence means the possibility of solving the case never necessarily disappears. In Angie's case, the possibility survived for 23 years. The original DNA profile became the bridge between two different eras of forensic science. One era could establish that an unknown male had left biological material connected to the crime. The next era could identify him through relatives and confirm his identity through direct testing. That progression illustrates how scientific breakthroughs can alter the meaning of old evidence. The evidence itself did not change. The ability to read it did. And perhaps that is why the case remains so important. It reminds investigators that an unanswered question is not necessarily an impossible question. Sometimes the answer exists inside the evidence but remains hidden because nobody yet has the right tool to reveal it. The same principle applies to other cold cases. Investigators may have evidence that produced no match decades ago. A database may have been too small. A laboratory technique may have been too limited. A genealogical connection may not have existed. Years later, all of those conditions can change. New relatives enter databases. New algorithms become available. Laboratories improve their testing methods. Investigators learn from earlier cases. Suddenly, the impossible becomes possible. For Angie Dodge, that transformation happened when genetic genealogy connected the unknown profile to a family line, and investigators eventually identified drips. The final confirmation through direct DNA comparison made the connection undeniable, but the human cost remained. Angie's family had spent years wondering whether the person responsible would ever be found. They had lived with an absence that could not be explained. They had watched other cases receive attention while Angie's remained unresolved. The identification of drips finally answered the central question, but it could not eliminate the years of uncertainty. Cold case families often describe the passage of time differently from everyone else. For the outside world, decades can make a case seem distant. For a family, the victim remains exactly where the tragedy left them. 23 years can pass, but the person they lost does not become 23 years older. Angie remained 21. Her family aged. Technology changed. The investigation changed. But Angie's age remained frozen. That is one of the most painful truths in any murder investigation. Time moves forward for everyone except the victim. The case can become a historical story, but the loss remains personal. And when a case is finally solved, the family must confront both relief and grief. There is relief because the unknown has become known. There is grief because the answer confirms what they already knew. Someone deliberately took the life of the person they love. The investigation, therefore, had to balance forensic precision with human reality. DNA can identify a person, but it cannot measure grief. A court can overturn a conviction, but it cannot restore lost years. A confession can explain responsibility, but it cannot restore the victim's future. Those limitations do not make the breakthrough meaningless. They make it more important. Justice is not only about reversing the past, it is also about establishing the truth so that the victim is not forgotten and the wrong person is not left carrying the blame. The Angie Dodge case eventually accomplished both. The truth about the DNA was established. The real offender was identified. Tapp's conviction was overturned. The case demonstrated the value of evidence preserved across decades, yet the investigation also left a warning. Every case begins with uncertainty. Every investigator is capable of making assumptions. Every witness can be wrong. Every theory can become too powerful. The only safeguard is the willingness to test conclusions against evidence. The Angie Dodge case showed why that principle mattered. When modern DNA contradicted the old conclusion, investigators had to follow the evidence rather than defend the history. That willingness ultimately changed the lives of everyone involved. The man responsible could no longer remain hidden behind an unidentified DNA profile. The innocent man could no longer remain imprisoned under a conviction the evidence had disproved, and the family of Angie Dodge could finally hear the answer they had been waiting for. Yet the story remained haunted by one unavoidable fact. The answer had taken 23 years. 23 years of silence. 23 years of uncertainty. 23 years during which the evidence remained hidden in plain sight. The killer had not been erased from the case. His DNA had remained there all along. What had been missing was the connection. Once genetic genealogy provided that connection, the past opened again. A tiny biological trace became a family tree. A family tree became a suspect. A suspect became a DNA match, and the DNA match became the foundation for a confession and a legal reversal. The entire case had been transformed by something microscopic. That was the irony at the heart of the story. The evidence that eventually changed everything was almost impossible to see, yet it carried information powerful enough to overturn a conviction, identify a killer, and reopen a case that had remained unresolved for decades. The investigation had begun with a young woman's death and ended with modern science forcing the past to answer for itself. But even after the name of the killer became known, the story of Angie Dodge remained bigger than the man who killed her. It became a story about what happens when evidence survives longer than mistake. It became a story about how a wrongful conviction can be exposed years later. And it became a reminder that sometimes justice does not disappear. Sometimes it waits. The word exonerated can sound like an ending. But for Christopher Tapp, it was the beginning of a life he had not expected to get back. For years, his name had been tied to the murder of Angie Dodge, and the conviction had followed him through every attempt to challenge it, every appeal, every legal argument, and every day behind prison walls. Then the DNA evidence changed the meaning of the entire case. The genetic material recovered from Angie's murder did not belong to Tapp. It belonged to Brian Drips. That fact was no longer a theory. It was supported by direct forensic comparison, and the investigation had ultimately produced a confession from Drips. The case that had once seemed to have a single suspect now contained two radically different identities: the man who had been convicted and the man whose DNA was actually connected to the crime. For Tapp, the distinction was everything. For Angie, it was the difference between an unanswered murder and an identified killer. For investigators, it was a reminder that a case can remain unresolved even after a courtroom has declared it finished. The original conviction had created a sense of finality, but DNA had refused to accept that finality. It remained an unresolved piece of the puzzle, a biological signal that could not be persuaded to conform to the conclusion reached years earlier. As technology advanced, that contradiction became increasingly important. The case was eventually reopened through a combination of modern DNA analysis and forensic genetic genealogy, a method that allowed investigators to search beyond conventional criminal databases and look for relatives connected to an unknown DNA profile. That approach was particularly important because the unknown male whose DNA had been recovered from Angie's case was not identified through a traditional direct database match. Instead, investigators were able to follow a genetic trail that ultimately led toward Brian Drips. The process was painstaking. A genealogy lead does not automatically identify a murderer. It creates a direction. Investigators still have to determine whether the person is connected to the crime, whether the genetic evidence is consistent, whether the individual was in the relevant location, and whether a direct sample confirms the connection. In this case, the direct DNA comparison became the critical bridge. A cigarette, but associated with Drips, provided a source for comparison, and the DNA matched the biological evidence from Angie's case. The significance of that match was enormous because it transformed a decades-old, unknown profile into the identity of a living man. Suddenly, the investigators were no longer searching for an invisible offender. They had a name. They had a biological connection. They had